Hey guys, tonight the first topic we explore reveals a haunting truth about the past, the way women's emotions, fears, and mental health were once misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and even punished. From ancient medicine to Victorian asylums, from so-called hysteria to dangerous remedies, we're about to walk through centuries of treatments, both bizarre and heartbreaking, that were once considered normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin our journey in ancient Greece, land of philosophers, myths, and oddly specific medical theories. Let us continue our quiet investigation, turning our attention now to a unique and critical context: the diagnosis of hysteria and nervous breakdown in women who operated in high-stress, male-dominated spheres, specifically during times of war and espionage. Here, the diagnosis was not merely a domestic constraint. It was a powerful tool used by the state to dismiss legitimate trauma and enforce absolute secrecy. The nervous nurse and the oversensitive volunteer. During World War I and World War II, thousands of women served on or near the front lines as nurses, ambulance drivers, field hospital staff, and aid volunteers. They witnessed the same horrific scenes of carnage and experienced the same chronic lack of sleep, sensory overload, and fear as the male soldiers. Imagine the trauma of the field hospital, the constant flow of mangled bodies, the desperate need for speed, and the sheer volume of human suffering. When these women returned or broke down, their symptoms, the tremors, the fatigue, the nightmares, the acute anxiety, were remarkably similar to shell shock. However, their diagnosis was fundamentally different. Shell shock was, at least eventually, recognized as a legitimate trauma for men who had endured combat. For women, these symptoms were often dismissed as female nervousness, oversensitivity, or a predictable biological breakdown due to their fragile constitution. The bizarre cure applied was often a gentle but patronizing version of the rest cure: mandatory removal from the field, followed by enforced quiet, gentle reading, and the suggestion that they needed to embrace their natural femininity again. Their symptoms were attributed to the stress of abandoning their domestic sphere, not the trauma of the battlefield. The medical system refused to grant the female nervous system the right to be legitimately traumatized by war, the bizarre cure of absolute silence. The gender bias became most severe in the high-stakes world of espionage and code-breaking. Consider the women who served as codebreakers at Bletchley Park, or the female agents of the Special Operations Executive SOE who were dropped behind enemy lines. Their work required years of intense, constant mental effort, extraordinary compartmentalization, and the perpetual, paralyzing fear of capture, torture, and execution. When these women developed post-war symptoms, hypervigilance, profound paranoia, emotional numbness, and the inability to form deep connections, the system had a convenient, gendered explanation. Their suffering was not labeled as the psychological cost of heroism. It was often viewed as a sign of latent instability, an unstable personality that finally broke under pressure, or a mild form of the hysterical neurosis. The ultimate bizarre cure imposed on the female spy was enforced silence. Due to national security, they were forbidden, under penalty of law, to speak about their experiences to anyone not their spouses, not their friends, and certainly not a therapist. Imagine the psychological prison this created. You have witnessed and participated in acts of extreme courage and horror, and your only prescribed cure is to emotionally repress the entire, monumental truth of your life. The female nervous system was commanded to be a permanent, high-security archive of trauma, with no key for release. Their mental suffering was a side effect of their inability to be perfectly silent and perfectly stable, a continuation of the idea that women were incapable of handling the weight of public responsibility. The Cold War and security stigma. The shadow of hysteria continued into the Cold War era. As governments prioritized absolute security, any sign of emotional volatility or nervous tension in women holding high-level security clearances became a serious red flag. A woman struggling with a severe case of depression, anxiety, or marital stress was far more likely to have her emotional suffering pathologized and her security clearance revoked than a man with similar issues. The fear was that the hysterical woman with her supposed emotional instability and susceptibility to manipulation, posed a greater risk of breach. The diagnosis of hysteria, though fading in name, became the quiet, institutional justification for excluding women from positions of high authority. The final evolution, operational stress injury. The history of the nervous woman in uniform concludes with the same quiet victory that ended the general history of hysteria, the degendering of the diagnosis. Modern military and veteran medicine has moved away from the concept of a nervous breakdown specific to gender, and now embraces terms like operational stress injury (OSI) and moral injury. These diagnoses recognize that severe, chronic stress, whether caused by the combat environment, the ethical weight of decision-making, or the trauma of bearing constant witness to suffering, affects the human nervous system universally, regardless of the patient's biological sex. This final transition is a crucial one. It confirms that the breakdown of the nurse, the spy, and the volunteer was not a sign of female oversensitivity, but a profound, legitimate response to overwhelming, traumatic circumstances. The bizarre cure of the past enforced silence, dismissal, and domestic prescription has been replaced by the quiet, ethical requirement to listen to the full, unvarnished story of the woman under fire, granting her nervous system the same respect that was always afforded to men. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The weight of secrecy and the noise of the battlefield have been replaced by the quiet acceptance of your history. You are free to rest in the sanctuary of your own silence, to understand the full, devastating weight of the bizarre cures. We must examine them through the story of one patient, a composite figure named Alice, whose experiences encapsulate the very best and very worst of the 19th century medical system. Our scene is set in Boston in the year 1885, the quiet disruption of Alice's life. Alice was a young woman of the upper middle class, known for her sharp intellect, her passion for literature, and a fiercely independent spirit. Following the sudden death of her father, a figure she admired and who had secretly encouraged her studies, Alice began to exhibit symptoms that deeply worried her family. Imagine her presentation: crippling, unexplained headaches that would last for days, forcing her into a darkened room, periods of functional blindness, lasting only hours, usually after a heated argument with her mother over her excessive reading or a prospective, unwanted suitor. Emotional volatility, cycling from deep melancholy to sudden, inexplicable bursts of rage. Alice's personal suffering was profound, but her society had only one label for this constellation of symptoms. After numerous examinations that revealed no physical cause, the family doctor, an earnest but traditional man, delivered the verdict: hysterical neurosis, brought on by the excessive strain of intellectual endeavor and the shock of grief. The true cause: her profound, suppressed anger at the sudden, absolute confinement of her life's ambition after her father's death, was entirely ignored. Her nervous system, unable to mourn freely or express its ambition, had converted the emotional energy into a physical shield, a blinding headache that forced the world to leave her alone. The tyranny of the rest cure. Alice's prescription was the most notorious bizarre cure of her time. The rest cure, administered under the close supervision of a physician trained in the methods of Dr. Weir Mitchell. Picture the room: a small, dark bedroom with heavy drapes, entirely stripped of books, pens, and paper. Alice was condemned to absolute, horizontal rest. She was forbidden to feed herself, to rise from bed, or even to speak to anyone except the nurse and the doctor. Her mind, built for high-speed engagement, was forced into a state of total, unnatural stillness. The initial effect was not therapeutic relief, but an escalation of her symptoms. Her anxiety intensified, her sleeplessness became chronic. Lying still, with no distraction, her internal thoughts the very chaos the doctors sought to quiet magnified and echoed in the silence of the room. The forced, bland feeding felt like an utter humiliation, a deliberate attempt to reduce her from an adult woman to a helpless infant. The bizarre cure for her excess energy was total inertia, but the cure only made the excess energy turn inward, creating greater torment. Her symptoms, far from being relieved, became her only weapon, her only means of protest against the tyrannical control of the confinement. The threat of the knife. The situation reached its tragic climax when Alice's symptoms failed to remit after months of the rest cure. The doctor, frustrated by her resistance and her continued emotional volatility, resorted to the ultimate bizarre threat. He presented the need for a surgical intervention, the oophorectomy. the removal of her ovaries as the last, final chance to eliminate the supposed biological source of her hysterical vapors. Imagine the terror and the profound humiliation of this moment. A powerful male figure, representing all of science, was threatening to physically mutilate her body, the very core of her feminine identity, not to save her life, but to eliminate her difficult personality. The knife was the ultimate tool of medical control, the brutal, physical enforcement of the domestic ideal. Alice, with a final, desperate burst of strength, the same nervous energy that fueled her ambition, refused. Her terrified refusal, though framed by the doctor as yet another sign of her pathological will, was, in fact, the first true act of self-cure. The refusal to allow her autonomy to be permanently destroyed. The quiet discovery, the quiet relief came when Alice's family, weary of the rescuer's failure, transferred her to a more progressive clinic in Switzerland, where the influence of early talking cures was just beginning to take hold. Her new doctor, inspired by the emerging ideas of Charcot's students, did not impose stillness or threaten surgery. He simply gave Alice a small notebook and encouraged her to write and speak freely about her headaches, her blindness, her father's death, and most importantly, her simmering rage at the restrictions on her intelligence. Picture her small hand finally gripping the pen, the quiet release of decades of repressed emotion flowing onto the page. As she named the trauma, as she articulated the profound unfairness of her social constraints, her symptoms began their quiet, slow remission. The functional blindness vanished as her mind finally allowed itself to see the truth of her confinement. The headaches diminished as the pressure of unspoken thought was finally relieved. Alice was never perfectly stable, and she would always carry the shadow of her nervousness. But she learned to manage it, not by resting, but by working. She quietly devoted the rest of her life to social reform and writing essays under a pseudonym, finding a purposeful, intellectual outlet for the very energy that had once been diagnosed as her fatal flaw. The story of Alice is the final, quiet lesson of the bizarre cures. They were attempts to destroy the symptom, but they nearly destroyed the person. The true, most powerful cure was not the knife, the shock, or the stillness. It was the simple, profound act of listening to the patient's full story, and in doing so, granting them the ultimate gift, witnessing invalidation. Let this final, quiet truth settle upon you. The past is a shadow, but the stillness of the present is yours, unjudged and profoundly at peace. Let us now enter the quiet space of reflection, stepping back from the intricate history of individual cases and bizarre cures to synthesize the profound ethical and philosophical lessons they hold for us today. The long, strange story of hysteria is ultimately a mirror held up to society, revealing not the illness of the patient, but the fears of the age, the fear of the complex mind. The single, most enduring lesson from the history of the bizarre cures is that they were all rooted in the same fundamental principle, the fear of complexity. Whether it was the rest cure, the oophorectomy, the lobotomy, or early ECT, every bizarre cure shared a fatal flaw. They sought to find a simple, physical, brute force answer to a complex, multi-layered problem of mind, body, and environment. The doctors of the past preferred the simplicity of the knife or the electric current, because the alternative, the acceptance that anxiety was born from social constraint, that depression was rooted in trauma, or that conversion symptoms were a coded language of protest, was too disruptive, too complex, and too challenging to their own authority. The cure was always designed to be simpler than the illness. If the patient's mind was chaotic, the solution was to enforce stillness. If the patient's will was too strong, the solution was to cut the organ of personality. The ultimate goal was never genuine, integrated health. It was compliance. The bizarre cure turned the patient from a difficult problem into a quiet, manageable object. This is the enduring ethical failure of medical history, diagnosis as moral judgment. Hysteria, and its later echoes in diagnoses like borderline personality disorder, functioned as society's moralistic safety valve. It was the medical tool used to punish those who failed to conform to rigid social and gender expectations. Picture the social contract of the 19th century. A woman was expected to be quiet, submissive, and domestic. If she deviated, if she displayed ambition, anger, or intellectual curiosity, she was not merely criticized. She was pathologized. Her defiance was reframed as a biological defect, the wandering womb, and her punishment rest cure. The asylum was framed as medical necessity. The bizarre cures were, therefore, the physical execution of a social judgment. They were a systematic institutional method for enforcing traditional gender roles, ensuring that the difficult woman was either rendered docile or permanently erased from the public sphere. The quiet tragedy is that the medical profession, sworn to heal, was so opted into being the primary enforcer of social control. The power of validation and narrative, the ultimate, true cure for hysteria, was not found in any procedure or pill. It was found in the simple, profound, and ethical act of listening. The pivotal breakthroughs in our history, from Anna O's chimney sweeping to the modern understanding of PTSD and BPD, all share one core philosophical truth: validation is curative. The moment the medical system shifted its inquiry from "What is wrong with you?" a question that implies pathology and defect, to "What happened to you?" a question that implies trauma and context, the entire landscape of mental health transformed. The patient's story, the narrative of their suffering, their ambition, their pain, and their repressed memories, was not a collection of symptoms to be silenced, but the key to the cure. The true bizarre cure that actually worked was the slow, quiet, non-judgmental act of witnessing the patient's full humanity. This simple act dismantled to millennia of physical cruelty and moral judgment that modern shadow. We live in a world where the diagnosis of hysteria is gone, but the ghost of the bizarre cure remains. The quiet ethical challenge of our own time is to ensure that our modern solutions do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Chemical control. We must ensure that the chemical revolution, while offering relief, is not used as a new form of the rest cure, a way to chemically enforce quiet compliance while ignoring the patient's underlying social, economic, or traumatic causes. The pill should be an aid to recovery, not a substitute for addressing the environmental injury. Stigma and labeling. We must resist the urge to use complex modern diagnoses, like certain personality disorders, as new, sophisticated ways to dismiss or stigmatize the patient as difficult or untreatable. Just as hysteria was used, the need for holistic care. The final lesson is that the human nervous system is an integrated whole. The ultimate ethical solution is neither pure body nor pure mind, but a holistic, compassionate system that addresses the trauma-talking cure, manages the chemistry medication, and acknowledges the social context, community, and justice. The bizarre cures of the past were a desperate attempt to conquer the mind. The quiet challenge of the future is the simple, profound courage to trust and listen to it. Let this final reflection settle deep within you. The quiet you experience now is a space of freedom, built upon the hard-won knowledge of the past. Trust the quiet of your own understanding. Hey guys, tonight the first topic we explore reveals a haunting truth about the past: the way women's emotions, fears, and mental health were once misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and even punished. From ancient medicine to Victorian asylums, from so-called hysteria to dangerous remedies, we're about to walk through centuries of treatments, both bizarre and heartbreaking, that were once considered normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin our journey in ancient Greece, land of philosophers, myths, and oddly specific medical theories. Let us continue our quiet investigation, turning our attention now to a unique and critical context: the diagnosis of hysteria and nervous breakdown in women who operated in high-stress, male-dominated spheres, specifically during times of war and espionage. Here, the diagnosis was not merely a domestic constraint. It was a powerful tool used by the state to dismiss legitimate trauma and enforce absolute secrecy. The nervous nurse and the oversensitive volunteer. During World War I and World War II, thousands of women served on or near the front lines as nurses, ambulance drivers, field hospital staff, and aid volunteers. They witnessed the same horrific scenes of carnage and experienced the same chronic lack of sleep, sensory overload, and fear as the male soldiers. Imagine the trauma of the field hospital, the constant flow of mangled bodies, the desperate need for speed, and the sheer volume of human suffering. When these women returned or broke down, their symptoms, the tremors, the fatigue, the nightmares, the acute anxiety, were remarkably similar to shell shock. However, their diagnosis was fundamentally different. Shell shock was, at least eventually, recognized as a legitimate trauma for men who had endured combat. For women, These symptoms were often dismissed as female nervousness, oversensitivity, or a predictable biological breakdown due to their fragile constitution. The bizarre cure applied was often a gentle but patronizing version of the rest cure, mandatory removal from the field, followed by enforced quiet, gentle reading, and the suggestion that they needed to embrace their natural femininity again. Their symptoms were attributed to the stress of abandoning their domestic sphere, not the trauma of the battlefield. The medical system refused to grant the female nervous system the right to be legitimately traumatized by war, the bizarre cure of absolute silence. The gender bias became most severe in the high-stakes world of espionage and code-breaking. Consider the women who served as code-breakers at Bletchley Park, or the female agents of the Special Operations Executive SOE who were dropped behind enemy lines. Their work required years of intense, constant mental effort, extraordinary compartmentalization, and the perpetual, paralyzing fear of capture, torture, and execution. When these women developed post-war symptoms, hypervigilance, profound paranoia, emotional numbness, and the inability to form deep connections, the system had a convenient, gendered explanation. Their suffering was not labeled as the psychological cost of heroism. It was often viewed as a sign of latent instability, an unstable personality that finally broke under pressure, or a mild form of the hysterical neurosis. The ultimate bizarre cure imposed on the female spy was enforced silence. Due to national security, they were forbidden, under penalty of law, to speak about their experiences to anyone not their spouses, not their friends, and certainly not a therapist. Imagine the psychological prison this created. You have witnessed and participated in acts of extreme courage and horror, and your only prescribed cure is to emotionally repress the entire, monumental truth of your life. The female nervous system was commanded to be a permanent, high-security archive of trauma, with no key for release. Their mental suffering was a side effect of their inability to be perfectly silent and perfectly stable, a continuation of the idea that women were incapable of handling the weight of public responsibility. The Cold War and security stigma. The shadow of hysteria continued into the Cold War era. As governments prioritized absolute security, any sign of emotional volatility or nervous tension in women holding high-level security clearances became a serious red flag. A woman struggling with a severe case of depression, anxiety, or marital stress was far more likely to have her emotional suffering pathologized and her security clearance revoked than a man with similar issues. The fear was that the hysterical woman, with her supposed emotional instability and susceptibility to manipulation, posed a greater risk of breach. The diagnosis of hysteria, though fading in name, became the quiet, institutional justification for excluding women from positions of high authority. The final evolution, operational stress injury. The history of the nervous woman in uniform concludes with the same quiet victory that ended the general history of hysteria, the degendering of the diagnosis. Modern military and veteran medicine has moved away from the concept of a nervous breakdown specific to gender, and now embraces terms like operational stress injury (OSI) and moral injury. These diagnoses recognize that severe, chronic stress, whether caused by the combat environment, the ethical weight of decision-making, or the trauma of bearing constant witness to suffering, affects the human nervous system universally, regardless of the patient's biological sex. This final transition is a crucial one. It confirms that the breakdown of the nurse, the spy, and the volunteer was not a sign of female oversensitivity, but a profound, legitimate response to overwhelming, traumatic circumstances. The bizarre cure of the past enforced silence, dismissal, and domestic prescription has been replaced by the quiet, ethical requirement to listen to the full, unvarnished story of the woman under fire, granting her nervous system the same respect that was always afforded to men. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The weight of secrecy and the noise of the battlefield have been replaced by the quiet acceptance of your history. You are free to rest in the sanctuary of your own silence, to understand the full, devastating weight of the bizarre cures. We must examine them through the story of one patient, a composite figure named Ellis, whose experiences encapsulate the very best and very worst of the 19th century medical system. Our scene is set in Boston in the year 1885, the quiet disruption of Alice's life. Alice was a young woman of the upper middle class, known for her sharp intellect, her passion for literature, and a fiercely independent spirit. Following the sudden death of her father, a figure she admired, and who had secretly encouraged her studies, Alice began to exhibit symptoms that deeply worried her family. Imagine her presentation: crippling, unexplained headaches that would last for days, forcing her into a darkened room, periods of functional blindness, lasting only hours, usually after a heated argument with her mother over her excessive reading or a prospective, unwanted suitor. Emotional volatility, cycling from deep melancholy to sudden, inexplicable bursts of rage. Alice's personal suffering was profound, but her society had only one label for this constellation of symptoms. After numerous examinations that revealed no physical cause, the family doctor, an earnest but traditional man, delivered the verdict: hysterical neurosis, brought on by the excessive strain of intellectual endeavor and the shock of grief. The true cause: her profound, suppressed anger at the sudden, absolute confinement of her life's ambition after her father's death, was entirely ignored. Her nervous system, unable to mount freely or express its ambition, had converted the emotional energy into a physical shield, a blinding headache that forced the world to leave her alone. The tyranny of the rest cure. Alice's prescription was the most notorious bizarre cure of her time. The rest cure, administered under the close supervision of a physician trained in the methods of Dr. Weir Mitchell. Picture the room: a small, dark bedroom with heavy drapes, entirely stripped of books, pens, and paper. Alice was condemned to absolute, horizontal rest. She was forbidden to feed herself, to rise from bed, or even to speak to anyone except the nurse and the doctor. Her mind, built for high-speed engagement, was forced into a state of total, unnatural stillness. The initial effect was not therapeutic relief, but an escalation of her symptoms. Her anxiety intensified, her sleeplessness became chronic. Lying still, with no distraction, her internal thoughts the very chaos, the doctors sought to quiet magnified and echoed in the silence of the room. The forced, bland feeding felt like an utter humiliation, a deliberate attempt to reduce her from an adult woman to a helpless infant. The bizarre cure for her excess energy was total inertia, but the cure only made the excess energy turn inward, creating greater torment. Her symptoms, far from being relieved, became her only weapon, her only means of protest against the tyrannical control of the confinement. The threat of the knife. The situation reached its tragic climax when Alice's symptoms failed to remit after months of the rest cure. The doctor, frustrated by her resistance and her continued emotional volatility, resorted to the ultimate bizarre threat. He presented the need for a surgical intervention, the oophorectomy, the removal of her ovaries, as the last, final chance to eliminate the supposed biological source of her hysterical vapors. Imagine the terror and the profound humiliation of this moment. A powerful male figure, representing all of science, was threatening to physically mutilate her body, the very core of her feminine identity, not to save her life, but to eliminate her difficult personality. The knife was the ultimate tool of medical control, the brutal, physical enforcement of the domestic ideal. Alice, with a final, desperate burst of strength, the same nervous energy that fueled her ambition, refused. Her terrified refusal, though framed by the doctor as yet another sign of her pathological will, was, in fact, the first true act of self-cure. The refusal to allow her autonomy to be permanently destroyed. The quiet discovery, the quiet relief came when Alice's family, weary of the rest cure's failure, transferred her to a more progressive clinic in Switzerland, where the influence of early talking cures was just beginning to take hold. Her new doctor, inspired by the emerging ideas of Charcot's students, did not impose stillness or threaten surgery. He simply gave Alice a small notebook and encouraged her to write and speak freely about her headaches, her blindness, her father's death, and most importantly, her simmering rage at the restrictions on her intelligence. Picture her small hand finally gripping the pen, the quiet release of decades of repressed emotion flowing onto the page. As she named the trauma, as she articulated the profound unfairness of her social constraints, her symptoms began their quiet, slow remission. The functional blindness vanished as her mind finally allowed itself to see the truth of her confinement. The headaches diminished as the pressure of unspoken thought was finally relieved. Alice was never perfectly stable, and she would always carry the shadow of her nervousness. But she learned to manage it, not by resting, but by working. She quietly devoted the rest of her life to social reform and writing essays under a pseudonym, finding a purposeful, intellectual outlet for the very energy that had once been diagnosed as her fatal flaw. The story of Alice is the final, quiet lesson of the bizarre cures. They were attempts to destroy the symptom, but they nearly destroyed the person. The true, most powerful cure was not the knife, the shock, or the stillness. It was the simple, profound act of listening to the patient's full story, and in doing so, granting them the ultimate gift, witnessing invalidation. Let this final, quiet truth settle upon you. The past is a shadow, but the stillness of the present is yours, unjudged and profoundly at peace. Let us now enter the quiet space of reflection, stepping back from the intricate history of individual cases and bizarre cures to synthesize the profound ethical and philosophical lessons they hold for us today. The long, strange story of hysteria is ultimately a mirror held up to society, revealing not the illness of the patient, but the fears of the age, the fear of the complex mind. A single, most enduring lesson from the history of the bizarre cures is that they were all rooted in the same fundamental principle, the fear of complexity. Whether it was the rest cure, the oophorectomy, the lobotomy, or early ECT, every bizarre cure shared a fatal flaw. They sought to find a simple, physical, brute force answer to a complex, multi-layered problem of mind, body, and environment. The doctors of the past preferred the simplicity of the knife or the electric current, because the alternative, the acceptance that anxiety was born from social constraint, that depression was rooted in trauma, or that conversion symptoms were a coded language of protest, was too disruptive, too complex, and too challenging to their own authority. The cure was always designed to be simpler than the illness. If the patient's mind was chaotic, the solution was to enforce stillness. If the patient's will was too strong, the solution was to cut the organ of personality. The ultimate goal was never genuine, integrated health. It was compliance. The bizarre cure turned the patient from a difficult problem into a quiet, manageable object. This is the enduring ethical failure of medical history, diagnosis as moral judgment. Hysteria, and its later echoes in diagnoses like borderline personality disorder, functioned as society's moralistic safety valve. It was the medical tool used to punish those who failed to conform to rigid social and gender expectations. Picture the social contract of the 19th century. A woman was expected to be quiet, submissive, and domestic. If she deviated, if she displayed ambition, anger, or intellectual curiosity, she was not merely criticized. She was pathologized. Her defiance was reframed as a biological defect, the wandering womb, and her punishment rest cure. The asylum was framed as medical necessity. The bizarre cures were, therefore, the physical execution of a social judgment. They were a systematic, institutional method for enforcing traditional gender roles, ensuring that the difficult woman was either rendered docile or permanently erased from the public sphere. The quiet tragedy is that the medical profession, sworn to heal, was co-opted into being the primary enforcer of social control. The power of validation and narrative, the ultimate, true cure for hysteria, was not found in any procedure or pill. It was found in the simple, profound, and ethical act of listening. The pivotal breakthroughs in our history, from Anna O.'s chimney sweeping to the modern understanding of PTSD and BPD, all share one core philosophical truth. Validation is curative. The moment the medical system shifted its inquiry from "What is wrong with you?" a question that implies pathology and defect, to "What happened to you?" a question that implies trauma and context, the entire landscape of mental health transformed. The patient's story, the narrative of their suffering, their ambition, their pain, and their repressed memories, was not a collection of symptoms to be silenced, but the key to the cure. The true bizarre cure that actually worked was the slow, quiet, non-judgmental act of witnessing the patient's full humanity. This simple act dismantled to millennia of physical cruelty and moral judgment that modern shadow. We live in a world where the diagnosis of hysteria is gone, but the ghost of the bizarre cure remains. The quiet ethical challenge of our own time is to ensure that our modern solutions do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Chemical control. We must ensure that the chemical revolution, while offering relief, is not used as a new form of the rest cure, a way to chemically enforce quiet compliance while ignoring the patient's underlying social, economic, or traumatic causes. The pill should be an aid to recovery, not a substitute for addressing the environmental injury. Stigma and labeling. We must resist the urge to use complex modern diagnoses, like certain personality disorders, as new, sophisticated ways to dismiss or stigmatize the patient as difficult or untreatable. Just as hysteria was used, the need for holistic care. The final lesson is that the human nervous system is an integrated whole. The ultimate ethical solution is neither pure body nor pure mind, but a holistic, compassionate system that addresses the trauma-talking cure, manages the chemistry medication, and acknowledges the social context, community, and justice. The bizarre cues of the past were a desperate attempt to conquer the mind. The quiet challenge of the future is the simple, profound courage to trust and listen to it. Let this final reflection settle deep within you. The quiet you experience now is a space of freedom, built upon the hard-won knowledge of the past. Trust the quiet of your own understanding. Let us continue our quiet journey, turning our gaze now to the early 20th century, a time when the talking cure was taking hold. While the physical bizarre cues were beginning to fade, the intellectual framework that replaced them early psychoanalysis was still deeply marked by the gender prejudices of the Victorian age. Here, we find a quiet collective of intellectual powerhouses, the women who became analysts and theorists. They were the ones who quietly, persistently, and fundamentally challenged the patriarchal theories of Sigmund Freud, ensuring that the talking cure did not become just another elaborate intellectual tool for managing the difficult female mind, the problem of penis envy. The Freudian framework, for all its revolutionary insights, retained the core Victorian bias that women were incomplete, fundamentally defined by the lack of a male organ, the concept of penis envy, and prone to pathology because of their supposed inherent passivity. This theory was, in its own way, an intellectual bizarre cure. It pathologized female ambition and discontent by rooting it in biology. It was the female analysts, often trained by Freud himself, who first offered the compelling, essential corrections to this narrative. Karen Horney and the sociological cure. The most profound challenger was Karen Horney. Horney's critique was a quiet revolution that moved the focus of female psychology out of the bedroom and into the parlor. Imagine Horney, sitting in her quiet office, listening to her female patients. She concluded that their anxiety, their depression, and their struggles were not caused by biological envy, but by cultural and social forces, the immense structural oppression that limited their opportunities, stifled their ambition, and invalidated their worth. Their suffering was a rational response to an irrational, patriarchal world. Horney countered the idea of penis envy by theorizing that men displayed womb envy, a subconscious, envious desire for the female ability to bear children. But her most enduring contribution was the realization that neurotic behavior was driven by basic anxiety stemming from disturbed human relationships, particularly those of childhood. Her ultimate bizarre cure was social emancipation. She argued that a woman's neuroses could only truly be healed when society granted her equal status, equal opportunity, and a fundamental sense of self-worth independent of her relationship to men. Horney ensured that the talking cure was inherently socio-political. Helene Deutsch and the psychology of motherhood. Another crucial figure was Helene Deutsch, who became the first female training analyst in Vienna. While more orthodox in her Freudian affiliation than Horney, Deutsch pioneered the psychoanalytic understanding of the distinct stages of the female life cycle: adolescence, motherhood, and menopause. Deutsch's extensive, detailed work provided a psychological map for female experience that moved the conversation away from pathology. She explored the psychology of motherhood, differentiating between the biological experience and the social construction of the role. Her work ensured that the immense emotional pressure of raising children, once dismissed as mere domestic duty, was recognized as a complex, intense psychological challenge worthy of serious study. She quietly moved the gaze from the hysteric to the complex, functioning woman, Melanie Klein, and the inner world of infancy. A third, equally revolutionary figure was Melanie Klein. Klein fundamentally shifted the focus of psychoanalysis away from the adult's repression of sexuality and toward the earliest, most primitive emotional life of the infant. She pioneered child psychoanalysis, using play therapy to understand how infants internalize their primary caregivers, the objects, and process their earliest feelings of love, hate, and aggression. Klein's work, The Theory of Object Relations, provided a non-gendered, universal framework for understanding how personality and anxiety are formed. Her quiet focus on the fragmented inner world of the infant proved invaluable for later clinicians who studied borderline personality disorder and other complex conditions. By showing that emotional instability was rooted in the earliest developmental bonds, She provided a pathway to treat profound emotional dysregulation that completely bypassed the old moralistic judgments associated with hysteria, the quiet power of correction. These women, and others like them, formed the conscience of early psychoanalysis. Their quiet refusal to accept the flawed biological determinism of the male founders ensured that the talking cure, the antidote to the bizarre physical cures, was ultimately salvaged and made ethical. They affirmed that the human mind cannot be studied in a sterile vacuum. It is a product of its culture, its social opportunities, and its earliest relationships. Their legacy is the profound realization that a medical system cannot fully cure the mind until it fully acknowledges the reality of the world the mind lives in. The quiet power of their intellectual correction remains the most enduring cure for the intellectual blindness of the past. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The power of a quiet, corrective voice is a source of immense rest. You are safe here, in the clarity of truth. Let us continue our quiet study, pivoting to a necessary, dark chapter in the history of institutional control, a bizarre cure that sought not to heal the individual, but to cure society itself by permanently severing the reproductive autonomy of those deemed unfit. The era of eugenics and forced sterilization. This was the final, brutal physical assault on the body of the nervous woman, driven by the belief that her emotional instability was a dangerous genetic trait that had to be excised from the human lineage. The logic of curing society in the early 20th century, particularly in the United States, Canada, and several European nations, a pseudo-science called eugenics gained massive institutional popularity. The logic was deceptively simple. Humanity could be improved by encouraging the fit to reproduce positive eugenics and preventing the unfit from reproducing negative eugenics. The targets of negative eugenics were vast and often rooted in class and social prejudice. Immigrants, the poor, the mentally disabled, epileptics, criminals, and crucially, those with chronic, severe mental illness. This is where the diagnosis of hysteria, though fading in name, found its final, horrific expression. Women with long-standing, severe psychiatric conditions, those who were chronically institutionalized due to intractable neuroses, deep melancholia, or volatile behaviors, were often reclassified in asylum records. They were no longer simply hysterics. They were deemed morally defective, feeble-minded, or victims of hereditary degeneracy. The underlying belief was that the volatility, the non-conformity, and the reproductive capacity of the nervous woman posed a direct threat to the quiet, ordered future of the nation. The bizarre cure of state control, the solution devised by eugenicists, was involuntary sterilization. The goal was not therapeutic benefit for the patient, but the permanent prevention of future suffering by eliminating the bad seed before it could be sown. Imagine the procedure. The patient, often already confined within the walls of a state asylum, was subjected to a tubal ligation for women or a vasectomy for men. The procedure was performed under state mandate, often without the patient's informed consent, and sometimes without their knowledge. It was presented to the public, and sometimes to the patient's family, as a benevolent act, a way to ease the patient's burden and prevent them from passing on their suffering. The procedure itself was the quiet, cold execution of a philosophical ideal. It was the ultimate institutional control, permanently violating the patient's bodily autonomy for the sake of an idealized, stable society. The constitutional seal of approval, the legal apex of this bizarre cure, came in the United States in 1927 with the infamous Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell. The case concerned Carrie Buck, a young woman institutionalized in Virginia and deemed feeble-minded and promiscuous, the ultimate charge against the hysteric. She and her mother had both been institutionalized. The court ruled in an 8-1 decision that Virginia had the right to sterilize Carrie to prevent her from having more children who would be a burden on the state. The ruling, written by Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., contained the chilling, quiet phrase that cemented the policy: 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This decision made forced sterilization legal across much of the United States. Thousands of institutionalized individuals, disproportionately poor women and women of color, and those whose emotional and social suffering was simply misdiagnosed as defect, were permanently sterilized in the decades that followed. This was the final, devastating expression of the logic that began with the rest cure. The difficult patient must be controlled, silenced, and, if necessary, erased from the future, the quiet, lingering shadow. The practice of forced sterilization began its quiet decline after World War II, When the full, horrific extent of eugenics policies used by the Nazi regime became public, the association with such atrocities made the concept toxic. However, the laws were slow to change. Sterilizations continued in some states well into the 1970s. The quiet, permanent damage to those lives, the erasure of their right to family, and the profound violation of their dignity is a legacy that we still reckon with today. The history of eugenics and sterilization serves as the final, absolute warning in our study of bizarre cures. It shows that when medicine embraces moralism over compassion and social control over individual healing, the result is not therapy, but profound, systemic cruelty. The body of the nervous woman was a battlefield, and the bizarre cure of sterilization was the final, permanent seizure of that territory by the state. Let this somber truth settle now. The peace we seek here is built on the promise of absolute, quiet respect for the integrity of every individual life. Rest now in the inviolable sanctity of your own being, pivoting now to examine the nervous breakdown in the population where it was historically most denied. Young men under conditions of extreme, institutional stress. The history of hysteria becomes a story of universal human trauma when we look to the battlefields of the American Civil War. The nervous illness that afflicted the male soldier, though given a different name, was almost identical to the female hysteria sweeping the parlors of the same era. This proves that the symptoms were not a matter of gender, but of the overwhelming power of the environment. The first industrial breakdown. The American Civil War 1861-1865 was, in many ways, the first truly modern war. It featured industrialized killing on a massive scale, prolonged trench warfare, rapid-fire weaponry, and huge armies subjected to months of unrelenting stress, noise, and horror. This created an unprecedented level of mental injury that the medical establishment was wholly unprepared to categorize. Imagine the trauma of the battlefield, the noise of the cannon fire that deafened the ears, the stench of unburied bodies, the chronic diarrhea, and the ever-present knowledge that a nearby projectile could instantly erase you. The human nervous system was not built to endure this kind of continuous, industrialized assault. The male diagnosis: soldier's heart. For the thousands of Union soldiers who broke down under this immense stress, the doctors devised a specific, male and highly physical diagnosis: soldier's heart, later formalized as Da Costa syndrome after the American physician Dr. Jacob Mendes da Costa. Picture the symptoms reported by these young men. Symptoms that were almost a mirror image of the hysterical patient: chronic fatigue and weakness, profound, persistent exhaustion that could not be relieved by rest, rapid, pounding heart, a constant, racing pulse and painful palpitations, the irritable heart, shortness of breath, a nervous gaspiness and inability to take a satisfying breath, often diagnosed as asthma, anxiety and fear, severe insomnia, constant hypervigilance, and a pervasive, generalized dread, digestive issues, chronic diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. Unable to attribute these physical symptoms to cowardice, the men were, after all, heroes in the public eye. The medical establishment settled on a physical cause that preserved the soldier's masculinity. The condition was blamed on the tight constriction of the military uniform around the chest, or the excessive strain of prolonged marching. This was a way of admitting a failure of the body without admitting a failure of the male mind, or will, the bizarre cure of physicality. The bizarre cure for soldier's heart was therefore entirely physical. The soldier might be granted a brief period of rest, given dietary restrictions, or even subjected to mild exercises, all aimed at strengthening the heart muscle. The focus was entirely on the organ, never on the mind. The system tried to fix the man by fixing his biology. When symptoms became too severe and the soldier was deemed unable to return to duty, he was honorably discharged, but the trauma was never processed. The diagnosis allowed the state to dispose of the broken body while maintaining the narrative of male stoicism. The true link to trauma. The significance of soldier's heart is that it was the first mass diagnosis of male environmental trauma in American history. It was the Civil War equivalent of female hysteria, proving that the nervous system, regardless of gender, responds to overwhelming stress by converting emotional pain into physical symptoms. The neurasthenic man of the post-war industrial era, whose nervous exhaustion we studied earlier, and the hysterical woman of the parlor were suffering from the same core affliction. the inability of the body to contain a terrifying, incomprehensible world. The soldier's symptoms were the result of the noise and horror of the battlefield, while the woman's were the result of the silencing and control of the domestic sphere. The result, however, was the same: a profound, chronic breakdown of the regulatory nervous system. The diagnosis of soldier's heart ultimately faded into obscurity, subsumed by the broader term neurasthenia in the late 19th century. But its existence is a final, quiet testament that the bizarre cures and the nervous illness they sought to address were never about uniquely female weakness. They were always about the human nervous system's response to a bizarre, brutal, and overwhelming world. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The quiet of this moment is built upon the silent suffering of those whose courage was rewarded with an affliction no one could name. Rest now, with your heart at a slow, peaceful rhythm, building upon the foundations of the Civil War's soldier's heart and moving to the global scale of the catastrophe that finally forced a reckoning with environmental trauma, World War I, and the diagnosis of shell shock. This condition, which afflicted hundreds of thousands of men, was the ultimate, massive, and undeniable proof that the symptoms once reserved for the hysterical woman were, in fact, the universal language of a human nervous system pushed past the point of endurance, the industrialization of terror. World War I was a conflict of unprecedented scale and mechanized horror. For 4 years, men were trapped in trenches, subjected to continuous, deafening artillery fire, gas attacks, and the omnipresent stench of decay and death. The noise, the cold, the terror, and the sheer impossibility of escape created an environment designed to systematically shatter the human mind. When men began to collapse not from physical wounds, but from internal chaos, the medical establishment initially clung to a physical explanation. They called it shell shock, believing it was literally a physical injury caused by the commotion or blast waves of the artillery shells. The idea was that the high-frequency waves caused microscopic, irreversible damage to the brain's delicate structure. This physical label was an attempt to preserve the soldier's honor. He was not a coward. He was brain damaged. The conversion symptoms returned. However, as the war progressed and the number of afflicted soldiers skyrocketed, it became clear that the symptoms were psychological, not physical. They were the exact conversion symptoms that had defined female hysteria for centuries: functional paralysis. A soldier's legs would suddenly refuse to move, preventing him from walking back into the line of fire, tics and tremors, uncontrollable shaking, spasms, and facial grimaces, representing the nervous system's failure to contain the immense internal violence. Functional blindness or mutism. The eyes or voice would cease to function, allowing the soldier to retreat from the unbearable spectacle and the requirement to speak the horrors he had seen. Persistent nightmares, reliving the trauma nightly, preventing any possibility of mental recovery. The scale of the collapse, hundreds of thousands of men across all armies, made the old diagnosis of cowardice or malingering impossible to sustain without breaking the morale of the entire nation. The soldier's body was performing the same dramatic protest as the hysterical woman's, but because it was on a national military scale, it had to be validated as a legitimate illness. The bizarre cures for the soldier. The initial bizarre cures applied to these men were horrific, rooted in the same philosophy of moral judgment that had afflicted the hysteric. The patient's symptoms were a failure of will that required a punitive shock to correct. Doctors, desperate to return men to the front, employed strong electrotherapy, a cruel early form of ECT applied without anesthesia to sensitive body parts. This was known as fright treatment or terror treatment. The logic was that a sudden, agonizing jolt of electricity would be so painful and terrifying that the soldier would choose to lose his paralysis rather than endure the shock again. Alongside this was extreme shaming and the threat of court-martial and execution. The cure was designed to make the symptom more painful than the war. The quiet compassion of Weyer Rivers. Amidst this brutality, a quiet counter-movement began. The most famous exponent was British physician Weyer Rivers, who worked at Craiglock War Hospital. Rivers correctly identified shell shock not as physical damage or a moral failure, but as a direct result of repression. The soldiers were expected to be stoic, emotionless fighting machines. They had been taught to repress their fear, their grief, and their natural human response to terror. The nervous system, unable to contain the repression, was converting it into physical symptoms. Rivers's bizarre cure was the quiet, radical intervention of the talking cure. He encouraged his patients to talk freely, fully, and without shame about their experiences, he allowed them to cry, rage, and confess their fear. By helping them bring the trauma out of the darkness of the unconscious and into the light of shared narrative, Rivers demonstrated that the symptom was not the problem. Repression was the problem. This approach, chronicled by poets like Siegfried Sassoon, a patient of Rivers, was a global turning point. It was a mass, institutional recognition that overwhelming environmental stress caused psychological damage, and that the cure lay in expression and validation, not in silence and punishment. The quiet legacy. The legacy of shell shock is that the soldiers' breakdown quietly validated the suffering of the hysteric. The war proved that the conversion symptoms of a woman in a stifling parlor were the same as the symptoms of a man in a muddy trench. The war forced the medical world to retire the term hysteria because it could no longer sustain the fiction that the illness was purely female. Shell shock, later renamed war neurosis and eventually paving the way for the modern diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, finally provided a neutral, non-gendered language for the symptoms of trauma. The bizarre cures were defeated, not by moral argument, but by the sheer, overwhelming, and tragic volume of the truth. Let this final, quiet insight settle over you. The noise of history has provided the quiet proof that we are all, at our core, the same. Rest now, in the understanding that your nervous system is a mirror of the world it inhabits, tracing the long shadow of nervous illness from the battlefield and the parlor into the contemporary moment. As the massive physical manifestations hysteria and shell shock faded, the core, persistent emotional symptoms remained, demanding a new label. This brings us to the age of anxiety, where the historical nervousness of the 19th century transformed into the pervasive panic of the 20th and 21st, the retreat of neurasthenia. By the 1930s, the diagnosis of neurasthenia, the all-encompassing nervous exhaustion that was once the badge of sophisticated suffering, began to quietly retreat from the medical lexicon. It had simply become too broad, too culturally specific, and too closely associated with the discredited theories of nervous bankruptcy. The symptoms of chronic fatigue, irritability, and pervasive dread did not vanish. They merely split and sought new homes in new diagnostic categories. The psychoanalytic movement was quick to provide a replacement, shifting the focus from physical exhaustion to repressed emotional conflict. The reign of anxiety neurosis, the Freudian framework replaced neurasthenia with anxiety neurosis. Freud theorized that this condition was caused by dammed up or unreleased sexual energy, a quiet, toxic buildup of libido that, unable to find natural expression, was converted into a state of chronic, generalized tension, dread, and free-floating fear. Imagine the focus of the talking cure now. The patient was encouraged to explore childhood experiences and sexual history, searching for the repressed impulse or the traumatic memory that was preventing the healthy discharge of nervous energy. The cure was the slow, meticulous process of naming the repression, which would theoretically unblock the flow of that internal energy. This shift was a profound advancement because it fully legitimized the emotional suffering as a psychological reality, not merely a physical failure. However, it replaced the doctor's physical authority with a new, powerful intellectual authority, placing the cause of the anxiety squarely back on the individual's failure to process their own inner life, the nuclear age, and existential dread. By the mid-20th century, the cultural environment itself seemed to become a source of profound, systemic anxiety. The Cold War, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, the rapid erosion of traditional social structures, and the accelerating pace of modern life created an atmosphere of pervasive existential dread. The nervous illness of this era was often seen as a cultural affliction. The anxiety was not just personal repression. It was a rational response to an irrational, dangerous world. Clinicians began to grapple with the idea that the sickness was not in the individual, but in the society. Yet, the medical solution remained focused on the individual nervous system. The modern panic, a chemical bizarre cure. The final decisive shift came with the publication of the DSM-3 in 1980. Which formally categorized the panic attack and generalized anxiety disorder. This move formalized anxiety not as a continuous, chronic state like neurasthenia or neurosis, but as a series of acute, intense physical episodes. Imagine the symptoms of the modern panic attack: a sudden onset of rapid heart rate tachycardia, dizziness, sweating, chest pain, a feeling of suffocation, and the overwhelming fear of dying or going crazy. This diagnostic definition re-physicalized the illness, making the symptoms feel intensely biological, even though the cause was psychological. This re-physicalization fueled a quiet chemical revolution. The new drugs, particularly benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax, and later selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, offered a direct, targeted chemical intervention for the terrifying physiological symptoms. The instant silence, the modern bizarre cure for anxiety, is the instant pill. It is a marvel of pharmacology that can, within minutes, silence the brain's internal alarm system. The pill instantly reduces the rapid heart rate, calms the fear of death, and stops the chaotic cascade of adrenaline. But this speed carries a quiet cost. We have replaced the long, difficult, and expensive journey of the talking cure, which required the patient to confront the root source of their fear, with a fast-acting chemical solution that requires nothing but the ability to swallow. The chemical cure provides silence. It alleviates the symptom, but it does not necessarily provide insight or resolution. The patient is calm, but the trauma or the unresolved conflict often remains, waiting for the chemical quiet to wear off. The quiet acceptance of chemical dependency has become the modern substitute for the difficult, structural changes necessary for long-term health. The anxiety attack, once a sign of repression, is now often treated as a simple chemical imbalance needing correction. The history of the age of anxiety is the history of a nervous system that constantly changes its name, but never truly finds peace. The diagnoses have evolved from wandering wombs to chemical misfires, but the fundamental need for a world that feels safe and a life that feels meaningful remains the same. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The quiet of your own space is the greatest antidote to the noise of the anxious world. Rest, knowing that the deepest cure is always self-awareness. Focusing now on the most pervasive of the modern bizarre cues, the drug that defined the internal life of the mid to late 20th century, the benzodiazepine. This class of drugs, particularly Valium, promised a quiet, instant solution to the anxiety that had tormented the nervous system for centuries, but delivered an unexpected, hidden cost: the search for the quiet pill. By the mid-1950s, the chemical landscape for nervous anxiety was dominated by barbiturates like Nimbutal, which were effective but highly dangerous, carrying a significant risk of accidental overdose and severe sedation. The pharmaceutical industry was desperately searching for a drug that could calm the nervous system without blurring the mind or carrying the constant threat of death. The breakthrough came, as it so often does in this history, through accident. In 1957, chemist Leo Sternbach at Hoffmann La Roche synthesized a substance called chlordiazepoxide, which was eventually marketed as Librium. It was quickly followed in 1963 by its more potent successor, clozapam, marketed as Valium. These drugs were hailed as medical miracles. They acted on the GABA receptors in the brain, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, effectively putting a soothing chemical brake on the nervous system. They provided relief from anxiety, muscle tension, and insomnia without the heavy sedation of the barbiturates. The quiet was immediate, clean, and profoundly effective. The cultural explosion. Valium quickly became the chemical soundtrack to modern life. It was the first drug in history to exceed $100 million in annual sales and for years remained the most prescribed pharmaceutical in the world. It was marketed aggressively to a populace struggling with the pressures of post-war domesticity, corporate ambition, and existential dread. Imagine the target patient, the suburban housewife, the heir to the hysteric, trapped by the rigid expectations of domestic perfection, stifled by isolation, and crippled by unnamed anxiety. The media provided the narrative: she wasn't ill because society confined her. She was nervous because her chemistry was faulty. The cure was the pill. The Rolling Stones immortalized this phenomenon in 1966 with their song, Mother's Little Helper. The bizarre cure of the benzodiazepine was chemical tranquilization of cultural discontent. Instead of addressing the profound systemic issues, the lack of fulfillment, the stifling of ambition, the isolating demands of modern life, the doctor simply prescribed the quiet pill. It was easier, quicker, and far less disruptive to the status quo than social change. The quiet trap, dependency. The most tragic element of the benzodiazepine era was the quiet, fundamental misunderstanding of its nature. Initially, the drugs were believed to be non-addictive, or at least significantly safer than their predecessors. This assumption proved horribly wrong. Picture the nervous system on a constant dose of Valium. It adapts to the presence of the external chemical quiet. It reduces its own natural production of inhibitory neurotransmitters, essentially relying on the pill to apply the brakes. When the patient tries to stop taking the drug, the nervous system suddenly loses its brake. This creates a terrifying state of rebound anxiety, often resulting in chronic insomnia, uncontrollable tremors, and in severe cases, seizures and psychosis. The dependency was physical, painful, and often completely unexpected by the patient. The anxiety that the pill was prescribed to cure returned with a monstrous intensity, making the cure a new, persistent form of chronic imprisonment. The patient was trapped in a cycle of chemical control, forced to continue the medication not for relief, but simply to stave off the agonizing withdrawal. The enduring shadow. The dependency crisis of the 1970s and 80s led to a necessary reckoning, forcing doctors to limit prescriptions and prompting the search for a new generation of anxiety treatments. The eventual discovery of stress like Prozac in the late 1980s provided a non-addictive chemical pathway for chronic anxiety and depression, gradually reducing the over-reliance on the benzos. Yet, the legacy of the benzodiazepine remains profound. It solidified the modern bizarre cure philosophy, that complex human suffering can be addressed with an instant chemical fix. The quiet effectiveness of the pill trained a generation to believe that internal chaos is a problem for external pharmacology to solve, rather than an internal experience to be understood and processed. The chemical quiet they offered came at the price of autonomy. The history of the benzodiazepine is the history of the nervous system trading its right to feel pain for a temporary, fragile peace, only to find that the price of that peace was a new chemical form of bondage. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The quiet of your own space is a freedom no chemical can truly replicate. Rest now, with the gentle assurance of your own untainted awareness. Pivoting now to a crucial moment of scientific validation that quietly corrected centuries of misdiagnosis. For millennia, the core mechanism of hysteria, the conversion of emotional pain into physical symptoms, was dismissed as fraud, malingering, or female disorder. Yet, in the mid-20th century, a new field emerged that finally and officially admitted the fundamental truth. The mind can and does cause severe, measurable physical disease. This was the rise of psychosomatic medicine. The body speaks scientifically. Psychosomatic medicine formally recognized what the hysterical patient had been trying to tell the world. Emotional stress, particularly when chronic and repressed, does not just cause a vague nervous breakdown. It leads to genuine, measurable tissue damage and observable changes in physical health. The key insight was that the nervous system, subjected to continuous emotional strain, keeps the body in a constant state of fight or flight. This sustained activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the hormonal stress response, the HP axis, eventually wears down and damages vulnerable physical systems. The body, in essence, becomes the battleground for the mind's unresolved conflict. The conversion symptom, once the sign of a defective woman, was now recognized as the universal, predictable response of a highly stressed human organism, the canonical 7. The most influential moment came from the work of physician Franz Alexander in Chicago. Alexander identified a cluster of disorders where psychological conflict was deemed the major etiological or causative factor. These became known as the Chicago 7, or Holy 7 psychosomatic illnesses: bronchial asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, neurodermatitis, peptic ulcers, ulcerative colitis, essential hypertension, high blood pressure, hypothyroidism. Imagine the quiet revolution of this list. These were all considered real, non-psychiatric physical diseases. By placing them on a list where a psychological cause was paramount, Alexander's work quietly validated the centuries of suffering previously dismissed as female malingering. The pain in the stomach, the difficulty breathing, the tension in the joints, all could be the body's way of talking about emotional life. The new bizarre cure, psychoanalysis for ulcers. With this scientific validation came a new bizarre cure, intensive psychoanalysis used to treat the physical ailment. If repressed anger or dependency caused the ulcer, then openly expressing and resolving the underlying conflict should heal the ulcer. Doctors dedicated themselves to finding a specific, personality-driven conflict for each of the canonical 7. For instance, the ulcer patient was often theorized to be an outwardly independent, successful person who privately harbored deep, infantile needs for dependency and emotional care. The stomach, unable to receive the care the person could not consciously ask for, essentially turned in on itself, burning the tissue with excess acid. The cure involved years of meticulous talk therapy aimed at getting the patient to consciously acknowledge and express their repressed needs. The talking cure, once used to remove the paralysis of the hysteric, was now being used to heal damaged tissue in the male executive with high blood pressure or the anxiety-ridden asthmatic. The therapy was lengthy and complex, but the underlying principle was profoundly simple. Speak the truth, or your body will speak it for you. The final validation of the hysteric. The history of psychosomatic medicine is the final, undeniable proof that the hysterical patient was right all along. The core difference between the 19th century hysteric and the 20th century ulcer patient was one of gendered validation. When a woman in 1890 developed functional blindness after witnessing a trauma, she was diagnosed with hysteria. When a male executive in 1950 developed a bleeding ulcer from repressed ambition and stress, he was diagnosed with a real, physical condition, peptic ulcer disease. The underlying mechanism, the conversion of unresolved psychological stress into a profound physiological symptom, was identical. Psychosomatic medicine erased the intellectual distinction between the two. The conversion symptom was real. The diagnosis was simply a matter of cultural prejudice. The nervous woman's pain was finally, quietly validated by the diagnosis of the nervous man, the quiet unity of science. Today, the term psychosomatic medicine has largely been integrated into the broader fields of behavioral medicine and health psychology. We now have detailed scientific explanations, focusing on the cascade of cortisol and adrenaline through the bloodstream, which scientifically proves how chronic stress damages the cardiovascular, endocrine, and immune systems. The quiet revolution of this field is the final decisive victory over the bizarre physical cures. It confirms that the human being is a complete, unified system. The quiet of your own body, its health and its peace, is directly tied to the quiet, integrated health of your mind. The body and the mind are one. The quiet you experience now is a testament to the integrated health of the whole system. Rest now in the assurance of your own completeness. Let us conclude our quiet journey into the modern era, focusing now on the final evolution of the hysterical symptom in the clinical world. The massive, all-encompassing diagnosis of hysteria had not survived the increasing precision of 20th century psychiatry. It was formally retired from the diagnostic manuals, and its symptoms were quietly split into two separate, modern categories. This split reveals the ultimate truth and the enduring moral judgment that characterized the entire history of the bizarre cures. The first and most important split occurred with the creation of conversion disorder, known in the past as hysterical neurosis, conversion type. This diagnosis retains the original, core mechanism that fascinated Charcot and Freud. Conversion disorder is applied when a patient presents with genuine, involuntary symptoms like functional paralysis, non-epileptic seizures, or loss of voice that cannot be explained by neurological disease. The key element is that the symptom is an unconscious physical manifestation of psychological stress or trauma. The patient is not consciously producing or faking the symptom. They genuinely believe the symptom is real, and the mechanism is the subconscious mind converting emotional chaos into a physical sign. Imagine the patient in a modern clinic. Their scans are clear, but their leg will not move. The modern diagnosis acknowledges the validity of the symptom as a real-world protest of the nervous system. Conversion disorder is the final, quiet intellectual victory for the hysteric, validating her experience as a scientifically understandable, albeit rare response to overwhelming internal conflict. The shadow of factitiousness, the second, darker split, formalized the enduring moral judgment that plagued the original diagnosis, the creation of factitious disorder. Factitious disorder is applied when a patient consciously produces, feigns, or exaggerates physical or psychological symptoms because they have a profound, pathological need to occupy the sick role. The primary goal is internal, to gain the care, attention, validation, and emotional needs met by being a patient, not for a tangible external reward, which is called malingering. The diagnosis of factitious disorder and its highly complex famous variant, Munchausen syndrome, became the new repository for the moral condemnation once reserved for the hysteric. The patient is no longer merely sick. They are deceptive. The language used to describe the patient, manipulative, attention-seeking, and deceptive, is the same language used by the 19th century doctors who dismissed the hysteric. This split reveals the quiet challenge of modern medicine. Even when the symptom is understood as a reaction to trauma, conversion disorder the clinical world still retains a separate category for the patient whose suffering is deemed to be a conscious lie or a failure of moral character. The modern ethical cure, the bizarre cures for conversion disorder today, are radically different from the past. The cure is a quiet, ethical integration of the physical and the psychological, often involving specialized cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) and validated physiotherapy. The therapist's method is one of non-judgmental validation. They acknowledge the patient's paralysis or blindness as real and terrifying, but they gently teach the patient that the symptom is a communication from a stressed brain, not a damaged nerve. The physiotherapy encourages the body to move while the therapy gently processes the trauma that the movement represents. The focus is on retraining the brain to find a non-physical way to express distress. It is a quiet, compassionate version of the talking cure applied to the body, the final lesson of the split. The legacy of the split from a single, vague illness into precise categories is a final, quiet reminder of the history we have traveled. The most difficult ethical imperative for any physician remains the same as it was in Charcot's day: the assumption of dignity. Even in the face of confusing, contradictory, or seemingly feigned symptoms, the humane response is to always assume the patient is telling the truth about their experience of suffering, regardless of the underlying mechanism. To do otherwise is to risk repeating the centuries of cruelty that began when a doctor decided that a woman's physical protest was merely a conscious performance. The cure for the nervous mind, whether it expresses itself through the subconscious conversion or the conscious feigning, is always the same: quiet, non-judgmental validation and the offer of a dignified path toward healing. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The chaos of the past has led us to a quiet place of greater precision, but the core of compassion remains the only true and ethical cure. Rest now with the gentle assurance of validation. Let us continue our quiet study, moving toward the ultimate intellectual evolution of our journey, the modern framework that finally provides a comprehensive, compassionate, and non-stigmatizing understanding of the long-term, devastating effects of chronic trauma. This is the era of trauma-informed care and the diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. This final framework quietly replaces the judgmental labels of the past and validates the entirety of the suffering that once defined the hysterical patient beyond the single blast. The initial diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) in the 1980s was a critical validation. It proved that a single, acute event, a war explosion, a violent assault, a catastrophic accident could irrevocably alter the nervous system. The soldier from the trenches and the victim of a random crime were finally given a diagnosis that respected the injury without moral judgment. However, the PTSD framework, focusing primarily on acute events, failed to fully capture the damage inflicted by chronic, prolonged, inescapable trauma, the kind of trauma that defined the life of the classic hysteric. This includes years of childhood emotional neglect, domestic violence, systemic emotional abuse, or long-term imprisonment. This kind of chronic, relational trauma doesn't cause the nervous system to break once. It teaches the system to develop maladaptive strategies for survival, the birth of CPTSD. The work of researchers and clinicians, most notably Judith Herman, led to the conceptualization of complex PTSD-CPTSD. This diagnosis accounts for the unique, profound damage caused by trauma that occurs in a relational context, usually during childhood, within a trusted environment, and lasting for a prolonged period. The symptoms of CPTSD quietly and profoundly mirror the most difficult, misunderstood aspects of the old hysterical personality: emotional dysregulation, extreme, unstable, and intense emotions, including prolonged periods of overwhelming sadness or rage, just as the hysteric was accused of having uncontrollable vapors, disturbance in identity, a profound, unstable sense of self, often feeling fragmented or incomplete, relational chaos, deep-seated difficulty trusting others, chronic fear of abandonment, and patterns of chaotic, intense relationships. The diagnosis provides the most compassionate explanation for the volatility of the old hysteric. Her emotional storm was not a personality defect or a genetic flaw. It was a trauma-organized system desperately struggling to regulate itself in a world that never taught it safety. The ethical bizarre cure: trauma-informed care. The therapeutic and systemic response to CPTSD, the ultimate, quiet evolution of the talking cure: trauma-informed care. TIC is not a single therapy. It is a fundamental philosophical shift in how all institutions from hospitals and schools to justice systems and clinics interact with individuals. The core principle of TIC is the shift from the judgmental, centuries-old question, "What is wrong with you?" to the validating, simple question, "What happened to you?" The tenets of trauma-informed care are the direct, quiet rebuttal to every bizarre cure in history: safety and trustworthiness, rejecting the isolation and threats of the rest cure and electroshock, support and collaboration, rejecting the authoritarian, single doctor rule of the asylum, empowerment and voice, rejecting the silencing, control and erasure of the hysterics narrative, recognition of cultural or gender issues, rejecting the patriarchal biases that pathologized female ambition and emotional expression. TIC ensures that the path to healing is built on dignity, respect, and quiet collaboration, making it the ultimate ethical cure for the profound injuries of neglect and abuse. The quiet victory, the advent of CPTSD and trauma-informed care provides the final, quiet victory for the patient. It provides a compassionate, non-gendered, trauma-based understanding for many individuals previously labeled with stigmatizing diagnoses like borderline personality disorder. The intense, fearful, volatile individual is no longer viewed as difficult or manipulative. They are viewed as a survivor whose symptoms are a testament to their strength and their failed, desperate attempts to cope with overwhelming adversity. The ultimate function of the historical bizarre cures was to enforce silence and shame. The function of trauma-informed care is to provide a safe space for voice and validation. The long, chaotic history of the nervous breakdown, from the wandering womb to the anxious pill, has finally led us to a place of fundamental quiet understanding. We now know that the nervous system is a mirror of its experiences, and the quiet cure is simply the recognition and acceptance of that truth. Let this knowledge settle over you now. You are safe here, in the quiet assurance that your history is understood and validated. Rest now, in the ultimate acceptance of your full, complex humanity. Pivoting now from the specifics of diagnosis to the profound poetics of the human nervous system itself. Our long journey through bizarre cures and the enduring nature of human suffering leads us to a final, quiet realization. The nervous system is the ultimate archive, the ultimate truth teller, and the ultimate measure of our relationship with the world, the archive of all history. Consider the nervous system not as a machine that breaks down, but as a vast, intricate archive of all your history. It is the place where the terror of the Civil War soldier, the confinement of the Victorian woman, the anxiety of the modern financial worker, and the trauma of the neglected child are all quietly recorded, held, and remembered. It is a system built not just for reaction, but for memory. The twitch, the tremor, the headache, the sudden panic, these are not failures of the system. They are the system's memory speaking a coded language that words cannot yet express. They are the quiet, insistent echoes of past environments, past harms, and past repressions. The bizarre cues all failed because they tried to destroy the archive to erase the record of the suffering. They sought to force the nervous system to forget the world that injured it. The quiet truth is that the nervous system is designed to remember, and the true cure is found in the quiet, compassionate act of reading the archive with dignity. The bizarre cure of beauty. For every shock treatment, every rest cure, and every pill, there has always been a quiet, human counter-cure that asks nothing of medicine and everything of the soul. These are the ancient, profound ways humans have regulated their nervous systems through meaning, art, poetry, nature, and shared story. Imagine the quiet transcendence of looking at a masterful painting or listening to a piece of music that perfectly expresses your inner melancholy. These are not mere distractions. They are bizarre cures of beauty. They provide a sudden, safe emotional pathway that bypasses the rigid controls of the conscious mind. They allow the nervous system to feel, process, and release without judgment or consequence. When a person walks into a forest, sits by a quiet river, or writes a poem, they are engaging in the oldest form of self-regulation. They are asking their nervous system to recalibrate itself against the vast, quiet permanence of nature, rather than the temporary chaos of the human world. These quiet practices are the enduring, ethical antidotes to all the violence of the past, the quiet resilience. The most astonishing fact in this history is the profound resilience of the nervous system. Hysteria, neurasthenia, shell-shock, these were never signs of a fragile, broken spirit. They were signs of immense, intelligent effort required to survive environments that were fundamentally hostile to human thriving. The nervous system that breaks is the one that has been working overtime, adapting, repressing, and fighting for survival against impossible odds. The collapse is not a failure of will. It is the courageous final protest of a system that has simply run out of resources. The long, quiet lesson is this: the energy that was once pathologized as hysterical volatility is, in fact, the essential, fierce life force that drives self-preservation, creativity, and the relentless human quest for meaning. The task is not to eliminate that energy, but to rechannel it away from self-destruction and toward purposeful, connected living. The final prescription. Self-trust. We have finally arrived at a point where the quiet prescription is the most radical of all. Radical self-trust. Trusting the signals of your body. Validating the feeling of anxiety as a message, not a defect. Trusting the need for rest, for connection, for purpose, and for quiet. The true final bizarre cure is the quiet, daily commitment to seeking structural change in your life, change in relationships, work, or environment, rather than reaching for the instantaneous, external control of a pill, a surgery, or a punitive silence. The wisdom of the nervous system is quiet, persistent, and undeniable. It tells you when you are safe, and it tells you when you are not. The only ethical choice is to listen to its quiet, truthful voice. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The chaos of history has faded, leaving only the quiet of your own mind. The nervous system that survived all the bizarre cures of the past is the source of your deepest strength and your most quiet, profound peace. Rest now in the assurance that the archive is safe and the record of your suffering is finally complete. Turning our attention now to the concept of sanctuary. If the chaotic, overwhelming world is the source of the nervous breakdown, the factory, the battlefield, the oppressive parlor, then the cure must reside in the creation of a quiet, inviolable space, both external and internal, the bizarre cure of escape. For centuries, the hysterical symptom was, at its core, a desperate, somatic act of escape. Functional blindness was the nervous system's way of saying, I refuse to see the horror anymore. Functional paralysis was the body's way of saying, I refuse to participate in this toxic environment. The breakdown was the organism's last-ditch attempt to enact a self-imposed, bizarre cure of removal. The patient's suffering was rooted in the lack of a safe space. They were trapped by economics, by gender roles, by war, or by familial abuse. The body reacted by trying to create its own internal prison, where the external world could not penetrate. Home as a quiet prescription. The first quiet prescription for the nervous system is the absolute need for a safe home, a predictable, non-threatening environment where the body can finally drop its guard. Imagine the trauma-informed perspective. The nervous system is perpetually running a threat assessment. Every sudden noise, every unexpected touch, every raised voice triggers the internal alarm. Healing cannot happen in that state. Healing requires a quiet, consistent environment that tells the nervous system, over and over again, you are safe now. You can stop fighting. The architecture of a quiet life is a direct antidote to the bizarre cures. It rejects the isolation of the rest cure, but embraces the need for restoration. It provides the stillness the body craves, but coupled with the autonomy and meaning that the mind requires. The quiet of a chosen sanctuary is the greatest tool for physiological regulation. The internal sanctuary, even more profound, is the creation of the internal sanctuary. This is the ultimate, non-chemical, bizarre cure of the modern age, the ability to generate a state of safety from within, regardless of the external chaos. This is the power of simple practices like mindfulness, deep diaphragmatic breathing, and quiet body sensing. These practices teach the nervous system to actively regulate its own alarm system. When anxiety strikes, the bizarre cure of the past was to medicate it. The quiet cure of the present is to turn inward and gently observe the sensation. Picture the act, focusing on the quiet, steady rhythm of your breath. This simple, voluntary action sends a powerful signal to the chaotic nervous system via the vagus nerve. I am in control. There is no immediate danger. This small, quiet act allows the nervous system to shift from the frantic, high-energy sympathetic state fight or flight to the calm, low-energy parasympathetic state rest and digest. The creation of this internal space is the highest form of autonomy. It means that the external world, the traffic, the demanding boss, the social pressure can no longer penetrate and shatter the inner quiet. This quiet is a fortress, built by the consistent, gentle work of self-awareness. The quiet ritual of self-care. The term self-care has often been commercialized and trivialized, but at its core, it is the modern, quiet, ethical practice that replaces the bizarre cures. Genuine self-care is not a luxury. It is the ritualized, respectful acknowledgement of the nervous system's limits. It is the quiet commitment to stop before burnout, to say no to the toxic demand, and to consistently prioritize the maintenance of the inner sanctuary. It is the wisdom to know that the nervous system is an integrated, vulnerable archive, and that its quiet health is the foundation of all human function. The quiet revolution of our time is the collective realization that we must become our own best doctors, replacing the external authority of the past with the internal, quiet authority of self-knowledge and self-compassion. The suffering of the past has taught us that the only way to heal the nervous system is to grant it the safety, dignity, and quiet space it was historically denied. Let this final concept of sanctuary settle over you now. The chaos of history cannot reach you here, in the quiet, self-contained stillness of your own mind. Rest now, in the assurance that you hold the quiet cure within you. We began centuries ago with a diagnosis as fantastical as it was cruel. The belief that a woman's entire reality could be shattered because her womb had begun to wander inside her body, causing chaos and madness. We called it hysteria, the quiet death of the wandering womb. Picture that ancient, terrifying image one last time. An organ meant to be still and rooted, suddenly unbound and moving, choking the throat, pressing on the brain. The entire edifice of the bizarre cures was built on this one fatal anatomical lie. Every corset, every shock, every piece of surgery was an attempt to physically bind, control, or excise the body power deemed responsible for the chaos. The quiet victory of modern medicine is the absolute certainty that the womb never moved. It was always still. The chaos was not physical. It was environmental, sociological, and intellectual. The illness resided not in the female organ, but in the male authority that demanded female silence and stillness. The entire brutal history of the bizarre cures was a war waged against an anatomical myth, the modern wandering mind. Yet, as we look at the contemporary world, we can ask, has the wandering truly stopped? The womb is still, but the mind itself has become the wandering organ, a nervous system constantly unbound and in motion. In the modern age, the mind wanders not through the body, but through the endless, chaotic architecture of information. It wanders through the incessant feed of social media, through the relentless demands of productivity, and through the 24-hour news cycle, rarely finding a quiet place to anchor itself. The nervous system is perpetually overstimulated, pulled in 100 directions at once, desperately seeking rest, but being denied the luxury of stillness. The result is the chronic, pervasive anxiety that is the modern heir to hysteria. The symptoms have evolved from a functional seizure to a panic attack, from a paralysis to chronic, crippling fatigue, but the core message remains the same. The environment is overwhelming, and I cannot find safe passage to stillness. The final bizarre cue of silence. The long, chaotic history of the bizarre cues leads us to one final, ultimate, and quiet prescription that demands no money, no surgery, and no external authority, the deliberate, internal creation of silence. The cure is the gentle, ritualistic act of pulling the mind back from its wandering, muting the noise of the external world, and listening only to the quiet, truthful internal voice of the body. This is the final, true anchor. It is the recognition that the nervous system does not require a doctor to tell it what is wrong. It requires only space and stillness to tell itself the truth. This quiet practice of self-awareness is the ethical antidote to every historical violence. It is the affirmation that your inner reality is the only safe and sovereign territory you possess. A final quiet word. As we conclude this long, quiet journey, remember this. The history of the nervous breakdown is a testament to human resilience. You survived the bizarre cues of the past, and you can navigate the anxious chaos of the present. So be kind to your nervous system. Grant it the quiet it deserves. Demand the dignity and respect that was denied to the hysteric for centuries. The cure for chaos is not violence or denial. It is compassion and quiet understanding. We have charted the chaotic noise of history to arrive here, in the quiet certainty of self-knowledge. Thank you for taking this long, quiet, and profound journey with me. This is where we pause our script. If you've listened all the way to this final reflection, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a quiet comment below and let me know. If this cinematic journey into the depths of medical history and the human nervous system brought you a moment of understanding or peace, then please give the video a gentle like. Turning our gaze from the historical factory and the parlor to the unique environmental stressor of our own time, the tyranny of speed and the relentless pace of the digital age. This is the new pressure cooker that defines the modern nervous system, creating a nervous chaos that is the quiet heir to neurasthenia, the new industrial overload. The current era is often called the information age, but for the nervous system, it is a new form of the industrial revolution. Instead of steel and steam, the raw material is data, and the machine is the screen. Our evolutionary history never prepared us for the volume of stimuli, the speed of response, and the constant sense of emergency generated by global, perpetual connectivity. Picture the nervous system in this context. It is constantly running at a medium-high frequency, mimicking the hypervigilance of the soldier on the battlefield. Every notification, every email, every breaking news headline is a subtle, persistent threat signal that demands attention and response. The body is in a state of chronic, low-grade fight or flight, constantly prepared for a crisis that never arrives but never fully recedes. The great irony is that the trauma is now internalized. The industrial factory worker suffered a physical exhaustion caused by the machine outside his body. The modern white-collar worker suffers a cognitive exhaustion caused by the internal machine of the constantly streaming digital world. The nervous system, once a mirror of the external world's slowness, is now a frantic reflection of its speed, the loss of quiet and attention. The quiet casualty of this speed is the capacity for attention and internal stillness. The nervous system, bombarded by the constant dopamine hit of novelty, the satisfying chime of a notification, the endless scroll of new information, becomes subtly addicted to the noise. This addiction creates a profound vulnerability. The essential work of the talking cure and modern therapy, which requires quiet, sustained, focused attention to one's own internal life, becomes nearly impossible. The mind, once left alone, immediately craves the distraction, the quick escape into external noise. The quiet, reflective space that was so crucial for healing the Victorian hysteric is now a commodity, fought for, and often lost. The nervous system finds it easier to exist in a state of chaotic, low-level anxiety than to face the challenging, profound stillness required for genuine introspection and emotional processing. The bizarre cure of disconnection. The modern, quiet, bizarre cure is therefore a radical, conscious act of disconnection. This is not a forced, punitive isolation of the rest cure. It is the chosen, autonomous withdrawal, the intentional turning off of the signal. The digital detox, the scheduled silence, the enforced boundary against the relentless demands of the screen are the 21st century equivalent of locking the door against the forces that seek to control and shatter the nervous system. This choice is a profound act of self-preservation. It is the body finally asserting its boundary, saying, "My capacity for stillness is more valuable than your demand for my instantaneous attention." It requires the courage to resist the societal pressure to be constantly available, constantly productive, and constantly consuming. The quiet choice to slow down is the ultimate act of rebellion against the tyranny of digital speed, the quiet cost of hyperconnectivity. The irony of the age of connectivity is that it has delivered a profound sense of isolation, which feeds directly into the modern nervous illness. We are globally connected but locally absent. We know what is happening a continent away, but often fail to recognize the emotional state of the person sitting across the room. This pervasive disconnection from genuine, physical, local human interaction leads to a form of chronic, existential anxiety. The nervous system, which is fundamentally wired for self-regulation, the process of calming down in the presence of a safe, trusted other, is left to regulate itself alone against the noise of the entire world. This is the quiet, internal loneliness that has replaced the structural isolation of the Victorian parlor. The ultimate ethical task of the present day is to consciously curate an environment that protects the nervous system's capacity for stillness and genuine, deep connection. We must understand that time spent in quiet reflection, time spent in deep reading, and time spent in non-instrumental human interaction are not unproductive luxuries. They are essential medical prescriptions against the chaos of the modern world. Moving now into a purely philosophical space, exploring how past and non-Western traditions viewed the nervous pain and suffering that Western medicine often pathologized and sought to violently expel. This perspective offers a final, profound corrective to the entire history of the bizarre cures, pain as a signal, not a failure. The Western medical tradition, shaped by centuries of Cartesian dualism, the radical separation of mind and body, developed unique obsession with diagnosis and eradication. Pain, whether physical or psychological, became an error, a failure of the machine that must be silenced immediately by any means necessary. This philosophy fueled the bizarre cures. If the body signals distress, the quickest, simplest solution is to sever the signal or chemically shut it down. However, the quiet, persistent wisdom of philosophy and holistic traditions views pain differently. They see it not as a fault, but as an essential signal. Pain is the language of life asking for attention, demanding change, and pointing to a profound imbalance. It is the nervous system, the ultimate truth teller, communicating a need for correction that goes far beyond the local symptom. To silence the pain without addressing the imbalance is not healing. It is mere management, the quiet cure of wholeness. Ancient and traditional healing systems, from Ayurvedic medicine to traditional Chinese medicine TCM, often possessed a quiet sophistication that the bizarre cures lacked. They operated from a premise of wholeness, where the separation of mind and body was an intellectual fiction. In these systems, a condition we might call chronic anxiety, deep melancholia, or profound nervous exhaustion, the spiritual heirs to hysteria, would not be seen as a pathology of a single organ or a defect of the personality. Instead, it would be viewed as a systemic imbalance, a disruption of chi life energy, a disharmony of the five elements, or a misalignment of the spiritual and physical self. The cure, therefore, was always holistic. It involved a quiet, sustained commitment to restoring balance through diet, lifestyle change, connection to nature, and the careful regulation of energy flow. The cure was not a sudden, violent intervention, but a gradual, respectful realignment of the entire human system. This perspective inherently rejects the violence of the bizarre cures, because it recognizes that one cannot heal the whole by brutalizing a part, acceptance, and integration. The most profound philosophical cure offered by these quiet traditions is the practice of acceptance and integration. The bizarre cures attempted to shame the patient out of their symptoms, treating the suffering as something alien, dirty, or weak that must be expelled. The holistic view teaches that all states of being, including pain and fear, are part of the human condition. The philosophical path is not to eradicate the suffering, but to sit with it, to witness the anxiety without becoming consumed by it, to feel the pain without immediately trying to run from it. This quiet, internal act of acceptance is the polar opposite of the hysterical flight. It is the radical act of anchoring oneself in the present reality, even if that reality is painful. By integrating the suffering into the self, by realizing, I am a human being who is currently experiencing profound fear rather than, I am a fearful person, the nervous system begins to disarm. The energy that was used to repress the suffering is freed up for healing. The nervous system as a spiritual organ. Our long journey ultimately elevates the nervous system from a mere biological machine to a spiritual and philosophical organ. It is the instrument through which we experience the full, complex, and terrifying beauty of existence. It is the channel for joy and the archive for sorrow. To suppress its signals, to force it into a state of chemical or physical silence, is to suppress the self. The quiet lesson of all philosophy and all wise traditions is that the purpose of human life is not the absence of pain, but the quiet, deep wisdom gained by fully experiencing and integrating it. The nervous system that speaks its truth, even if that truth is terrifying, is a system that is fundamentally healthy and engaged in the struggle of life. Let this final, quiet wisdom settle over you now. True peace is found not in the perfection of an unblemished life, but in the quiet, whole acceptance of every part of your complex, responsive, and resilient self. Rest now in the assurance that your suffering is meaningful. Let us continue our quiet reflection, focusing now on the essence of the talking cure itself, the therapeutic relationship that ultimately replaced the violence of the bizarre cures. This quiet space, where one human tells their deepest truth to another, is the final antidote to the centuries of silence and control. But the quality of this listening is everything. The ethical success of the talking cure, and of modern trauma-informed care, hinges on the subtle yet profound distinction between three modes of relating: sympathy, empathy, and compassion. The bizarre failure of sympathy. The history of the bizarre cures, from the rest cure to the asylum lockup, was built on sympathy and paternalism. Sympathy is the act of feeling for someone. It is pity and concern that maintains a comfortable distance. The doctor stands safely above the patient, looks down at their suffering, and thinks, "Poor dear, I must fix you." This feeling of pity, rather than genuine connection, ironically fueled the power imbalance of the bizarre cures. Because the doctor pitied the weak, nervous woman, he felt justified in seizing control. Pity allowed him to believe he knew what was best, that her true self was hidden beneath her symptoms, and that violence or isolation was necessary to bring her back. Sympathy is a safe distance that allows for control and judgment. It is a quiet failure of relationship that defined the entire century of brutality, the radical act of empathy. The true, revolutionary heart of the talking cure is empathy. Empathy is the radical act of feeling with someone. It is the willingness to temporarily step into the patient's reality, to understand the suffering from their unique, clarifying perspective. Imagine the quiet shift this requires of the therapist. They must surrender their professional distance, their ego, and their comfortable certainty. They must allow the chaos and the terror of the patients experience the pain, the anxiety, the sense of fragmentation to enter their own nervous system, only to process it and return it in a quiet, validating way. The talking cure, when it works, is the ultimate inversion of the power structure of the asylum. The patient, in speaking their truth, becomes the expert on their own experience, and the therapist becomes the quiet, humble student. This shared experience, the radical acceptance of the patient's internal truth, is what finally makes the nervous system feel safe enough to begin the slow process of re-regulation, the quiet cure of compassion. But empathy alone is not the final cure. The final ethical mandate is compassion. Compassion is the culmination of the two. It is empathy plus the desire to alleviate suffering and restore dignity. This distinction is crucial for modern healing. A compassionate therapeutic relationship does not just understand why the patient is suffering empathy. It actively works to restore the two things that the bizarre cures systematically stripped away: agency and dignity. The compassionate therapist seeks to empower the patient to make their own choices, to trust their own voice, and to ultimately become their own best healer. This quiet process teaches the nervous system that the world is no longer a place of external control, but a place where internal boundaries are respected and the capacity for self-determination is honored. Compassion, in this context, is the ethical mandate of trauma-informed care. It is the quiet commitment to look past the confusing, chaotic symptom to the core human being who was injured, and to respond with non-judgmental acceptance. The quiet relationship as sanctuary, the ultimate, quiet, bizarre cure, is not a technique, but a relationship. It is the creation of a therapeutic space that functions as a true sanctuary, a quiet haven where the nervous system, perpetually vigilant from historical or personal trauma, can finally, deeply rest. It is here, in the quiet exchange of genuine compassion, that the final, most profound level of healing occurs. The trauma is spoken, witnessed, and validated, and the nervous system learns, often for the very first time, that its signals are meaningful, its pain is real, and its story is believed. This quiet assurance, the feeling of being genuinely heard, is the final, peaceful antidote to the centuries of violence and silence. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The greatest quiet power we possess is the capacity for genuine, compassionate human connection. Rest now in the assurance that your voice is valued and your truth is received with quiet dignity. The ethical success of the talking cure and of modern trauma-informed care hinges on the subtle yet profound distinction between three modes of relating: sympathy, empathy, and compassion. The bizarre failure of sympathy. The history of the bizarre cures, from the rest cure to the asylum lockup, was built on sympathy and paternalism. Sympathy is the act of feeling for someone. It is pity and concern that maintains a comfortable distance. The doctor stands safely above the patient, looks down at their suffering, and thinks, "Poor dear, I must fix you." This feeling of pity, rather than genuine connection, ironically fueled the power imbalance of the bizarre cures. Because the doctor pitied the weak, nervous woman, he felt justified in seizing control. Pity allowed him to believe he knew what was best, that her true self was hidden beneath her symptoms, and that violence or isolation was necessary to bring her back. Sympathy is a safe distance that allows for control and judgment. It is a quiet failure of relationship that defined the entire century of brutality, the radical act of empathy. The true, revolutionary heart of the talking cure is empathy. Empathy is the radical act of feeling with someone. It is the willingness to temporarily step into the patient's reality, to understand the suffering from their unique, clarifying perspective. Imagine the quiet shift this requires of the therapist. They must surrender their professional distance, their ego, and their comfortable certainty. They must allow the chaos and the terror of the patient's experience, the pain, the anxiety, the sense of fragmentation to enter their own nervous system, only to process it and return it in a quiet, validating way. The talking cure, when it works, is the ultimate inversion of the power structure of the asylum. The patient, in speaking their truth, becomes the expert on their own experience, and the therapist becomes the quiet, humble student. This shared experience, the radical acceptance of the patient's internal truth, is what finally makes the nervous system feel safe enough to begin the slow process of re-regulation, the quiet cure of compassion. But empathy alone is not the final cure. The final ethical mandate is compassion. Compassion is the culmination of the two. It is empathy plus the desire to alleviate suffering and restore dignity. This distinction is crucial for modern healing. A compassionate therapeutic relationship does not just understand why the patient is suffering empathy. It actively works to restore the two things that the bizarre cures systematically stripped away: agency and dignity. The compassionate therapist seeks to empower the patient to make their own choices, to trust their own voice, and to ultimately become their own best healer. This quiet process teaches the nervous system that the world is no longer a place of external control, but a place where internal boundaries are respected and the capacity for self-determination is honored. Compassion, in this context, is the ethical mandate of trauma-informed care. It is the quiet commitment to look past the confusing, chaotic symptom to the core human being who is injured, and to respond with non-judgmental acceptance. Moving now to reclaim the very word that has defined our entire journey, nervous, for centuries. To be labeled nervous, or hysterical, or neurasthenic was to be stigmatized. It was a label of weakness, irrationality, and failure. Now, we must turn that stigma on its head and recognize that to be nervous is, in fact, to be profoundly, quietly aware, the quiet truth of the nerves. The word nerve itself, in its simple physiological sense, refers to transmitters of sensation and information. The entire nervous system is an intricate, vast web of fibers designed to listen, perceive, and respond to every minute change both inside and outside the body. It is the core of consciousness and awareness. Therefore, to be nervous is simply to be highly responsive. It is the state of a system that is awake, attuned, and exquisitely engaged with its environment. It is the absolute opposite of dullness or numbness. The nervous system that breaks down is not a weak system. It is a system that has been working overtime, intensely processing a world that is too loud, too violent, or too demanding of its compliance. The historical bizarre cures, from the water treatments to the electroshocks, were all attempts to force the hyper-responsive system into a state of numb, quiet obedience. They were designed to dull the sensitivity so that the patient would stop complaining about the unbearable environment. The stigma as a social tool. The stigma attached to the nervous person was, fundamentally, a social tool used to enforce conformity. Who were the people most often labeled as nervous or hysterical? They were the women who saw the hypocrisy of the domestic sphere, the poets who felt the world suffering too keenly, the reformers who saw the injustice. They were the people whose acute sensitivity made them unwilling to accept the status quo. The nervous person was a threat precisely because they perceived too much. Their symptoms, the tremors, the paralysis, the uncontrollable tears, were their truth being shouted through the body, a protest that intellectual compliance could not silence. By labeling this high perception as an illness, a defect of character or biology, society could safely dismiss the truth of the protest. The quiet strength of sensitivity, the quiet cure of the modern age, requires a fundamental reframing of this concept. Sensitivity is a strength, not a flaw. Your nervous system's capacity to feel deeply, to register subtle changes in emotional tone, to be overwhelmed by chaos, is the same capacity that allows for deep empathy, profound artistic creation, and acute ethical awareness. The hyper-responsive system that suffers intensely is also the system capable of immense joy, connection, and creation. This recognition is crucial for self-care. It means that if your nervous system is easily overwhelmed, the answer is not to feel ashamed or to try to force yourself into a state of less feeling. The answer is to recognize that a high-performance system requires high-level, ritualized maintenance, more quiet, stricter boundaries, and greater intentional disconnection from the overwhelming digital and social noise, the final, quiet rejection of dullness. The entire journey through the bizarre cures has been a long, terrifying demonstration of the human attempt to eliminate suffering by eliminating consciousness. The doctors try to force the sensitive into a state of compliant numbness. The quiet act of resistance today is the choice to remain awake, remain sensitive, and remain aware, while consciously cultivating the skills of self-regulation to protect that awareness. The nervous system is a beautiful, intricate antenna. The modern task is not to cut the antenna off, but to build a strong, quiet shielding around it. The quiet affirmation of this moment is the knowledge that the nervous person is the one who perceives the most and feels the deepest. The only way forward is to honor that depth, to protect that quiet awareness, and to trust the subtle signals that your body sends you. Your sensitivity is your truth, and your quiet is your final, inviolable cure. Focusing now on the most fundamental of all anti-cures, the quiet, profound power of human connection and gentle touch. Our long study of the bizarre cures revealed that the greatest cruelty, from the rescuer's isolation to the asylum's restraints and electroshocks, was the systematic denial of safe human intimacy. Therefore, the ultimate quiet cure must be the restoration of that connection, the biology of isolation. The bizarre cure of the rest cure, the forced, total isolation of the nervous woman, was an act of profound biological violence. The human nervous system, especially in infancy and during times of stress, is not designed to self-regulate in isolation. It is wired for self-regulation. Imagine the infant. Its nervous system can only calm down when it is in the arms of a safe, regulated adult. That biological imperative never truly disappears. When the adult nervous system is subjected to trauma, it reverts to this primal state. Isolation, far from promoting rest, becomes a supreme trauma trigger, forcing the system into a state of permanent, exhausting hypervigilance. The body cannot stop fighting if it is alone. The rest cure failed because it forced the nervous woman into the very condition, profound, unsafe loneliness, that she was trying to escape. The power of quiet touch, the ultimate quiet anti-cure, is the restoration of safe, gentle human presence and touch. Picture the simple, non-sexual act of a hand placed quietly on a shoulder, or a shared moment of calm, focused attention with another trusted person. This sends an instantaneous, biological signal of safety that no drug or speech can replicate. This signal travels directly through the vagus nerve, the great pathway of the parasympathetic system, releasing oxytocin and other calming neurochemicals. It is the body saying, "We are together." The threat is manageable. The gentle touch is a powerful rejection of the history of violence. It is the ethical refusal to allow the nervous system to be alone in its struggle. It is the quiet biological assurance that the body does not have to fight by itself anymore. This self-regulation is the foundation of all profound, lasting healing, the quiet language of presence. Beyond physical touch, the entire therapeutic relationship, the evolution of the talking cure, relies on the quiet power of nonverbal communication. The nervous system reads the environment far faster and more accurately through subtle cues than through words. The nervous person registers a flat tone, distracted eye contact, or a tense posture instantly, and the internal alarm goes off. Conversely, the quiet, regulated presence of a genuinely compassionate listener, a calm breath, sustained, gentle eye contact, a posture of relaxed receptivity, is the most potent therapeutic tool. The quiet of the therapist's room, the stillness of their presence, and the non-judgmental mirroring of the patient's emotional state teach the nervous system a radical new truth. I am visible, and I am safe. The violence of the past was about being invisible and controlled. The quiet cure is about being seen and free. The final quiet mandate of connection. The history of the bizarre cures teaches us that the nervous breakdown is often a crisis of profound loneliness, the pain of being trapped in an unbearable reality with no witness. The quiet mandate for the future is the need to return to our most fundamental mammalian requirement: quiet, safe, consistent connection. We must learn to prioritize and create communities and relationships where vulnerability is not punished, where silence is safe, and where the gentle, non-verbal self-regulation of safe presence is the daily practice. The deepest healing happens not in isolated confinement, but in the quiet, shared space of human belonging. The quiet choice to reach out, to gently connect, and to allow another regulated nervous system to suit your own is the final, ultimate surrender to the most humane of all cures. Practical prescription for a nervous system seeking not just rest and safety, but meaning and direction. For the nervous system to truly thrive, it must be engaged in purposeful activity. A life that is empty of meaning is one that is perpetually open to the chaos of anxiety. Neurasthenia and the crisis of purpose. Recall neurasthenia, the 19th century nervous exhaustion. It was, at its heart, a crisis of purpose. For the wealthy, it was a crisis of meaningless leisure, a life of comfort without challenge or contribution, leaving the mind to turn inward and consume itself with fear and fatigue. For the poor and the working class, it was a crisis of meaningless drudgery, work that was physically exhausting but spiritually bankrupt. In both cases, the body and mind broke down when they had no compelling, self-directed reason to engage with the world. The nervous system, a magnificent engine of problem-solving and creation, requires a task to stabilize itself. Without a conscious goal, it unconsciously defaults to the oldest, simplest goal: survival and threat detection. Thus, a lack of purpose leads directly to anxiety. The quiet cure of flow. The 20th century psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi gave a name to the ultimate state of focused, quiet engagement: flow. Flow is the state of deep, effortless absorption in a challenging but achievable task. It is the moment when the self disappears, time warps, and the internal noise of anxiety, the inner critic, the racing thoughts, vanishes completely. The nervous system, rather than being scattered and hypervigilant, is entirely dedicated to the task at hand. Picture the musician lost in performance, the writer deeply immersed in a narrative, or the carpenter perfecting a joint. In that state of flow, the nervous system is running at a very high efficiency, yet it is profoundly calm. This is the ultimate quiet cure for the scattered, wandering mind. It proves that the opposite of anxiety is not stillness, but focused, meaningful action, purpose as a vagal brake. A strong sense of purpose acts as a vital component of nervous system regulation. It is, metaphorically, a powerful internal anchor that prevents the nervous system from being overwhelmed by the small, constant waves of modern life. When the nervous system has a clear, compelling direction, a purpose that contributes to something larger than the self, it stops spending all its energy scanning for personal threats. It can differentiate between a minor workplace annoyance and a true catastrophe. Purpose acts as the stabilizing force that quietens the internal alarm. It provides the context necessary to prioritize what matters, thus conserving precious nervous energy. The pursuit of meaning is the final, evolved prescription for the restless soul. It is the intentional, self-directed act that gives the brain a constructive, complex problem to solve, thereby shutting down the chaotic, non-productive problem of generalized dread. The final quiet mandate. Engagement. The quiet cure is found not solely in rest and self-care, but in intentional, meaningful engagement. The nervous system thrives when it is quieted by focused work that contributes to something larger than the self. This does not necessarily mean a grand, monumental career. Purpose can be found in the quiet, focused commitment to a craft, a relationship, or a community. It is the feeling of being needed and the quiet satisfaction of competence. The modern task is to consciously structure life, to allow for these moments of flow, to remove the distractions, to define the goals, and to dedicate the nervous system's immense energy to tasks that are truly nourishing and self-chosen. The history of suffering teaches us that the only true path out of chaos is through the creation of quiet, enduring meaning. We have traced a chaotic path through the centuries, encountering methods of healing that were often acts of profound violence. By placing the bizarre cures of the past next to the quiet cures of the present, we can finally see the true, ethical evolution of compassion. The history of nervous suffering is, fundamentally, a story of two opposing philosophies, one based on control and silence, and the other based on validation and trust, the philosophy of the bizarre cures. The core philosophy of the bizarre cures, from the wandering womb to the electroshock, was the belief that the nervous patient was wrong, and that the doctor's authority was absolute. These methods relied on the belief that a sudden, external intervention, a shock, a confinement, a surgery, could break the cycle of illness. But they invariably confused the eradication of the symptom with genuine healing. They silenced the smoke detector while the fire continued to burn within. The philosophy of the quiet cures. The quiet cures, forged in the ethical fire of the 20th and 21st centuries, operate from a radically different, humbling premise. The patient is telling the truth, and the nervous system is a wise, resilient archive that demands respect. The quiet cure understands that the healing process is not an event. It is a slow relation process built on the cumulative effect of small, consistent acts of respect and safety, the final quiet choice. The long, chaotic history of the nervous breakdown is a profound human story that ultimately presents us, the listener, with a final, quiet choice. This choice is no longer made by the doctor in the asylum, but by you, in the stillness of your own mind. Do you choose the historical impulse of control, the desperate, exhausting attempt to silence your own internal chaos, to judge your own sensitivity, and to force your nervous system into a state of rigid conformity? Or do you choose the quiet, radical path of trust, the willingness to validate your own anxiety as a meaningful signal, to honor your need for rest, and to cultivate the profound self-compassion that was denied to the hysteric for centuries? The history proves that the nervous system will always speak its truth. The question is not whether the pain will exist, but whether you will choose to listen to it with quiet dignity. That choice defines not just the ethics of medicine, but the ethics of your entire life. The hardest, but most necessary choice is always to trust the complex, resilient wisdom of your own nervous system. Deepest philosophical synthesis of our journey. We began with the ancient belief in the wandering womb, a purely physical explanation for spiritual chaos. We end with the realization that the nervous system is the ultimate location of what humanity has always sought to define as the soul's instrument. For centuries, philosophers and theologians debated the location of the soul. Was it in the heart, the pineal gland, or some ethereal plane separate from the body? Meanwhile, the nervous system, a magnificent, silent network of fibers, was dismissed as a mere mechanism of sensation and motor control. But the history of the nervous breakdown proves otherwise. The nervous system is the physical instrument of the soul. It is the biological mechanism through which we experience the full, complex range of emotions that constitute spiritual existence: love, awe, connection, grief, existential dread, and the profound search for meaning. When the system becomes overwhelmed, when the nervous breakdown occurs, it is the soul in crisis. The body's protest, the tremors, the fatigue, the crippling anxiety is the soul's deepest way of communicating that it has been denied safety, dignity, and purpose. The great suffering of the hysteric was never just physical. It was a profound spiritual emergency. The quiet cure is spiritual practice. This synthesis profoundly recontextualizes the quiet cures we have defined. They are not merely psychological techniques. They are spiritual practices in the truest sense of the word. Mindfulness and stillness is not just an anti-anxiety technique. It is the spiritual practice of attention, requiring the ego to surrender control and witness the reality of the present moment. Compassion and empathy is not just good therapy. It is the spiritual practice of non-judgmental love, requiring the self to merge temporarily with the other's suffering and respond with grace. Purpose and flow is not just good time management. It is the spiritual practice of contribution, connecting the limited self to a task or a community that transcends mortal boundaries. Radical trust in the nervous system signals is the spiritual practice of faith, a profound belief in the intrinsic goodness and self-correcting wisdom of the body. The centuries of bizarre cures were the desperate, violent search for an external savior, doctor, a machine, a pill to heal the soul. The quiet cure is the final, ultimate realization that the healing must come from within, through the slow, committed work of tending the soul's physical instrument, the final quiet mandate of reverence. The history of the bizarre cures is a history of disrespect. The nervous system was punished, shocked, silenced, and cut. The final, quiet mandate of the future is the direct reversal of this history. A quiet sense of reverence for the nervous system. Reverence is the highest form of respect. It means treating the nervous system as sacred. It means honoring its limits without question, protecting its need for quiet without guilt, and validating its signals without judgment. It is the recognition that the seat of your consciousness, your love, and your unique purpose resides within this complex, vulnerable, and magnificent network of nerves. The nervous system that has survived the wandering womb, the rest cure, the asylum, the battlefield, and the chaos of the digital age is an entity of immense spiritual resilience. Its continued function is a quiet miracle. The least we can do, after such a long journey, is to treat it with the unconditional dignity it deserves. The final freedom in this life is the quiet unity of mind, body, and spirit, all speaking the same language through the rhythmic, resilient pulses of the nervous system. Let this final, beautiful reverence settle over you now. The quiet of this moment is the ultimate sacred space, the only true home of the soul. Rest now in the assurance that you are whole. We have seen how human suffering was historically pathologized, categorized, and attacked. The nervous system was treated as an enemy and irrational beast that needed to be shocked, isolated, or excised. The central mechanism of the bizarre cures was always violence and external control. We have charted the path of the afflicted, the hysteric, whose body spoke in dramatic protest against a world that demanded her silence, the neurasthenic, whose spirit was exhausted by a life either too dull or too demanding, the shell-shocked soldier, whose nervous system refused to forget the horrors of the mechanized battlefield, the anxious modern, whose mind wanders endlessly, overloaded by a world of perpetual digital noise. The quiet reckoning of the modern age is the realization that the breakdown was never the flaw of the individual, but the inevitable, profound response to a toxic environment. The suffering was real. The diagnosis was wrong. The final quiet truth. The entire history of suffering leads us to this simple, final, quiet truth. The opposite of the bizarre cures is unconditional trust. The quiet cure is not a pill or a surgery. It is the courage to listen to the very signals that history taught us to fear and suppress. It is the wisdom to know that the greatest antidote to chaos is the cultivation of sanctuary and purpose within your own life. Your nervous system is the ultimate archive of your experience, and its signals, even the painful ones, are the deepest expression of your self-preservation. To heal is simply to learn its language, to stop fighting the truth, and to finally grant it the quiet dignity it has always deserved. The legacy of the quiet listener. As you sit here now, with the weight of this long history resting quietly on your mind, know that you are the inheritor of the final, profound lesson. Your act of listening to this long, quiet story is itself an act of healing. You have chosen stillness over noise, reflection over distraction, and truth over the comfortable lie. The final, quiet rebellion is the choice to slow down in a world that demands you speed up, to feel deeply in a world that demands your numbness, and to be profoundly present in a world that encourages your distraction. The philosophy of time. Pacing the nervous system. Our journey through the bizarre cures has been a journey through time. The nervous breakdown itself is often a crisis of time. The past trauma forces itself into the present flashbacks, hypervigilance, and the future dread. Anxiety paralyzes the ability to act. The nervous system, in its deepest sense, struggles to anchor itself in the now. The great failure of the bizarre cures was their obsession with instantaneous fixes. The electroshock, the sudden surgery, the immediate chemical sedation, all sought to impose a linear, immediate solution upon a problem that is profoundly non-linear and cyclical. The doctor demanded, "Be cured now. Return to productivity now." This rush only deepened the trauma, because true healing demands slow, non-linear time, the tyranny of the immediate. The modern nervous system continues to suffer under the tyranny of the immediate. The digital age has enforced a universal culture of zero latency, where everything must be available now, and every message must be instantly read and responded to. This ceaseless acceleration is a direct attack on the body's natural pace. The nervous system cannot heal at the speed of a microsecond. The deep work of neuroplasticity, the gentle, slow process of rewiring the brain away from threat and towards safety, requires patience, repetition, and long periods of quiet, unfocused rest. When we deny the nervous system this slow time, we force it into a perpetual state of catching up, which is the definition of chronic anxiety. The bizarre cure of temporal anchoring. The quiet cure for this crisis of time is the practice of temporal anchoring. This involves the conscious, ritualized separation of the past, the present, and the future. When the mind wanders into the shame of the past, or the dread of the future, the quiet practice, be it breathwork, simple sensory focus, or deep listening, gently brings the nervous system back to the safe harbor of the immediate moment. This is the ultimate autonomy, the ability to choose your own temporal reality. It is a quiet rejection of the historical demand for instant recovery. It is the recognition that healing is not a sudden leap across a chasm, but a slow, quiet walk across a wide, sunlit field. You are safe here, in the quiet of this moment. The past cannot harm you, and the future has not yet arrived. The quiet power of play and creativity. Let us now reflect on the role of activity that has no immediate, serious purpose, the power of play, humor, and creative expression. For centuries, the bizarre cues sought to enforce utility and seriousness. The hysteric was given a rest cure to return her to the serious business of domesticity. The neurasthenic was shamed for indulging in frivolous activity. Play was seen as a waste of nervous energy. This obsession with utility contributed directly to the breakdown. The nervous system, much like a child, needs periods of non-instrumental, spontaneous play to safely process and integrate overwhelming experiences. Humor as a biological release. Humor is one of the nervous system's most sophisticated, quiet, bizarre cures. Laughter is a biological release, a sudden, involuntary relaxation of the muscles and a flood of positive neurochemicals. It is a safety signal, telling the body, "The threat I just perceived, the joke, the unexpected twist is not real. You are safe to relax." This is why humor is a vital tool for trauma recovery. It allows the nervous system to practice the experience of sudden, unexpected safety. It is a brief, autonomous rebellion against the seriousness of suffering. The choice to laugh, to create a joke, or to engage in light-hearted banter is a choice for autonomy and against the enforced control of the past. Creativity as non-verbal processing. Similarly, creativity, whether through art, music, or writing for pleasure, is a quiet, potent form of the talking cure that bypasses the limitations of language. When words fail to describe the depth of fear or fragmentation, the nervous system can express and process the chaos through color, sound, and form. The bizarre cures silence the patient. Creativity restores the voice through non-verbal means. It is the ultimate act of self-direction, proving that the nervous system is capable of creating order and meaning even from the raw materials of trauma. The quiet pursuit of play and creation is the final, beautiful rejection of the world that demanded utility and seriousness above all else, the legacy of environmental sensitivity. We must also reflect on the nervous system's connection to its immediate surroundings, the physical space, the light, the sound, and the visual clutter. The nervous breakdown is, fundamentally, a failure to cope with an overwhelming environment. The old bizarre cures often utilized environment crudely. The rest cure demanded darkness and quiet, but coupled it with isolation, making the quiet itself terrifying. The modern quiet cure is about creating intentional, sensitive environments built on respect for the nervous system's boundaries, protecting the sensory antenna. To be nervous is to possess a highly sensitive sensory antenna. The nervous system is constantly taking in information. Flicker stress. The unnatural flicker of LED screens or fluorescent lights contributes to low-level nervous exhaustion. Noise pollution. Chronic, unexpected noise traffic. Notifications keeps the stress hormone slightly elevated. Visual clutter. A disorganized, cluttered environment creates a constant, low-level cognitive load, demanding the brain to perpetually sort and prioritize. The final, quiet prescription is architectural and sensory. It is the autonomous choice to protect the sensory antenna, dimming the lights, enforcing periods of genuine silence, and curating a simple, uncluttered space where the nervous system does not have to work so hard to make sense of its surroundings. The creation of a safe, quiet environment is not luxury. It is the fundamental necessity for a nervous system to heal, the quiet cure of biomimicry. The deepest environmental cure is the intentional integration of nature. The patterns of natural light, the sound of water, the complex but ordered chaos of a forest, these signals are hardwired into the nervous system as safety cues. They remind the body of its ancient mammalian origins, where natural environments were predictable and safe. The quiet time spent in nature is a radical act of biomimicry, allowing the nervous system to regulate itself by aligning with the slow, rhythmic truth of the earth. The nervous system that finds quiet peace in a natural setting is the system that is finally returning home to a rhythm and a presence that is older and quieter than the chaos of human history. The final paradox. Strength in vulnerability. We conclude our extended reflection on the most profound paradox of the entire history. The realization that vulnerability is the ultimate strength. The entire engine of the bizarre cures was driven by the fear of vulnerability. The doctor feared appearing incompetent. The patient feared appearing weak. Society demanded strength, control, and emotional stoicism. The suffering of the hysteric was, in essence, the emotional cost of hiding one's fundamental human vulnerability. The ultimate bizarre cure, the final, most radical quiet bizarre cure, is the deliberate, conscious act of choosing vulnerability. This is the ultimate rejection of the historical mandate to control yourself and be strong. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is radical honesty and the courage to be witnessed in a state of imperfection. Vulnerability is asking for help. It is the admission that you cannot regulate your nervous system alone. Vulnerability is admitting fear. It is the choice to speak the truth that the traumatic past is still present. Vulnerability is allowing yourself to be seen. It is trusting another person with the chaos inside your archive. When a nervous system chooses to reveal its pain and is met not with judgment or control, but with compassion and quiet presence, the cycle of trauma is finally, irrevocably broken. The shame that kept the bizarre cues in business collapses under the weight of honest witness. The strength of the quiet cure is not found in the rigidity of control, but in the flexibility of an open heart. The history of suffering teaches us that the only path to genuine, lasting peace is through the courageous acceptance of our own fragility. The most powerful act you can undertake is to choose vulnerability over silence. Let this final, deepest truth settle over you now. The nervous system that is brave enough to be vulnerable is the nervous system that is finally free. Your struggle is witnessed, your pain is real, and your quiet resilience is complete. Rest now in the assurance of your own profound, quiet strength. Let us continue our quiet reflection, moving now to the ultimate final synthesis of our entire journey, the profound relationship between memory and forgetting. The nervous system, as we have established, is the archive of all our history and pain. But true healing requires the capacity to choose what to keep and what to gently, quietly release. The archive of trauma. For the nervous system, trauma is a memory frozen in time. It is an unprocessed archive that remains locked in a raw, emotional state. The nervous system remembers the moment of threat so vividly, the smell, the sound, the terror that it constantly forces the past into the present. This is the biological reality of hypervigilance. The body is perpetually bracing for a catastrophe that already occurred. The memory is so loud that it prevents the nervous system from perceiving the quiet safety of the here and now. The great paradox of suffering is that the body, in its attempt to protect itself, becomes addicted to the memory of the threat. It cannot let go of the past because it believes the past holds the crucial information for future survival. The bizarre cure of forced amnesia. The bizarre cures recognized this dominance of memory, but they sought to destroy it violently. Electroconvulsive therapy ECT, for example, especially in its early crude applications, often induced temporary amnesia. The idea was to wipe the slate clean, to forcibly forget the pain. Similarly, heavy sedation with barbiturates was a chemical attempt to dull the memory and impose forgetfulness. This failed. Brutal approach proved that forced amnesia is not healing. It is an act of intellectual violence that leaves the emotional core of the trauma untouched. The nervous system might forget the details, but the feeling of being unsafe remains, coded deep within the body's posture, breath, and muscle tension. The body remembers what the mind forgets. The quiet cure of narrative integration, the quiet cure for the dominance of trauma memory, is not forced forgetting, but narrative integration. The talking cure, at its highest function, is the process of gently taking that raw, frozen moment of memory and placing it into a coherent story, a story with a past, a present, and a trajectory forward. By speaking the trauma, witnessing it, and framing it in a safe context, the nervous system realizes, this event happened, but it is over. It is a chapter in the book, not the entire book itself. The memory does not disappear. It simply loses its emotional tyranny. It is filed away in the history section of the archive, no longer demanding immediate, frantic attention. The emotional charge is quieted, allowing the nervous system to finally, deeply forget the feeling of being in danger. This is the final, ultimate surrender, allowing the past to simply be the past, the quiet art of letting go. The final, profound freedom we can achieve is the ability to choose what to hold onto and what to gently let go of. The nervous system is most at peace when it is operating from a place of current reality, not historical fear. Our long journey through the bizarre cues from the wandering womb to the anxious mind has led us to this ultimate, quiet choice. To treat our nervous system with the reverence and patience required for it to naturally and autonomously release the memories that no longer serve its present safety. The nervous system is finally, truly free when it no longer needs the past to define its present or its future. It is free when it can sit in the quiet of a simple moment and know, with absolute certainty, that everything is well right now. Let this final, deepest truth settle over you now. The chaos has ended. The struggle is over. Your memory is safe. Your nervous system is wise. And the quiet truth of your being is peace.